Graham Frederick Young was born on the 7th of September 1947 to Fred and Bessie Young
in Neasden, Middlesex in the UK. He also had an older sister, Winifred. Young's mother died of tuberculosis when he was only 14 weeks old. Fred, overcoming grief, felt he could no longer look after the children, so Young was sent to live with his aunt and uncle, whilst his sister was sent to live with their grandparents. Young spent 2 years living with his aunt and uncle
and became close to them. Eventually, his father recovered, remarried a woman called Molly, and the family reunited, moving to St Albans in the county of Hertfordshire, north of London. However, Young appeared to take separation from his aunt and uncle badly, and, from this point on, seemed to withdraw into himself and was described as, quote, a peculiar child who made no effort to socialise with other children. Young was a voracious reader, and, from the time he could read, was never far from a book. He became fascinated with 3 particular topics: poisoners, Nazi Germany, and the occult. With regards to the first of these topics, Young became particularly fascinated with the crimes of Hawley Harvey Crippen, who murdered his wife Cora with poison in 1910 before fleeing to America, before he was captured, returned to England, and executed that same year. Young also cited Victorian poisoner William Palmer as being a particular hero of his. Palmer was an English doctor, dubbed the, quote, Prince of Poisoners, who was executed by hanging in 1856 for the murder of a friend to inherit his estate. However, he suspects of killing around 15 people by poisoning, including his wife, 4 of his infant children, his brother, and his mother-in-law. Young's research led him, at a very young age, to have developed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of poisons. Young was also obsessed with Nazi Germany and would tell anyone who would listen how Hitler was, quote, misunderstood. He even took to making himself swastikas, including a brass medallion displaying this symbol, which he would proudly wear. With regards to the occult, Young appeared to fixate on this and developed a belief that he could receive power through sacrifice, and even allegedly tried to get local children involved in sacrificing cats for this purpose. Cats did disappear at an alarming frequency in the neighbourhood around Young's childhood home, and, whilst it was never determined to be him, I think this is likely. So you have a child with an in-depth knowledge of poisons who's obsessed with Hitler, the architect of a regime that exterminated millions of people through use of poison gas, as well as having a fixation on death and an obsession with famous poisoners. What could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, it turned out a lot, and this was enabled by a bizarre quirk of society at this time. Specifically, between at least the 1800s and it would appear until the 1970s, people could freely purchase lethal doses of poison without any real oversight or questions being asked. Poisons such as arsenic were freely available in different forms, including rat poison and flypaper, and others you could buy just in their natural state. All one needed to obtain this was to walk into a chemist, buy the items, and then sign what is known as the, quote, poison register. This still exists to this day, but in fact this case led to a tightening in the sale of poisons. However, back in the day, people would, it appears from looking at other cases, just sign the register, often giving false details without anyone batting an eyelid. This was apparently the case in the 1960s, where at the age of 13 years old, Graham Young walked into several chemists and, due to his extensive knowledge of poisons, was able to convince them that he was 17 years old. This enabled Young to purchase lethal quantities of various poisons, including his 2 favourites, thallium and antimony, with him signing the poison register as M.E. Evans. I'm not a chemist, but I've looked into both these substances that Young purchased, and they are vicious, with them causing, amongst other things, extreme abdominal and muscular pain, vomiting, diarrhea, hallucinations, as well as causing serious damage to the internal organs and nervous system. Death could be quick or slow, depending on whether single large doses are administered or smaller doses are given over a longer period of time. But as the organs and bodily functions are disrupted, individuals can die in excruciating agony. Thallium is particularly lethal, and even touching it can be deadly. How much poison Young was able to purchase at the age of 13 is not explicitly stated, but it's estimated that he was able to purchase enough to kill 100 to 300 people.
Young took these poisons and began experimenting with them, using a chemistry set that his father had bought him. But it's believed that Graham Young began poisoning others at around the age of 13, with him administering doses of poison to a child of a similar age called Christopher Williams. Christopher, I've read, was Young's only friend, and it was used as a type of guinea pig, with Young administering a cocktail of poisons over a protracted period of time, which meant he experienced vomiting, cramps, and headache. How he did this is unclear, but it appears that Young and Christopher would often exchange their sandwiches at lunchtime at school, so it's likely that Young laced these with poison. Christopher was lucky to survive, but it appears that Young was unsatisfied with this experience, as the poisoning meant that Christopher was off school, so he could not observe his experiment up close. Young needed subjects he could poison and then watch deteriorate, so he turned to his own family. In February 1961, still aged only 13, Graham Young began poisoning members of his own family. He first began by poisoning his stepmother, Molly Young, administering antimony to her drinks and food. This led to her suffering vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating stomach pains. In the next month, Fred Young, patriarch of the family, also suffered from similar stomach cramps, which would leave him bedbound for days at a time. In November 1961, Young's sister Winifred was given a cup of tea by her brother one morning, but found it tasted so sour she took one mouthful and then threw it away. An hour later, she was on a train to work, where she began to hallucinate. Members of the public had to help her when she collapsed at the train station, and an ambulance was called. Tests in hospital revealed she'd been poisoned. Fred suspected his son of having been responsible and searched his room where his chemistry set was located. However, Fred took no further action, aside from telling Young to be careful in the future when, quote, messing about with those bloody chemicals. It appears that over 1961, Young was administering small doses of poison, specifically antimony, to his sister, father, and stepmother. But in 1962, the main focus of his experiment was his stepmother, Molly. On the evening of the 21st of April 1962, Molly was found writhing in agony in the garden, with Young stood watching her, fascinated by her death throes. It transpired that Young had either got bored of the protracted nature of his current experiment or decided to escalate his behaviour and had poisoned Molly with a lethal dose of thallium the day before. Molly was taken to hospital, where she died in agony a few hours later. Her death was assigned to complications related to a car accident which she'd recently had, which I find inexplicable. Young suggested that Molly should be cremated, which occurred, so no further examination of her corpse could take place. Graham Young appeared to be fixated on harming as many people as possible, and at Molly's wake, he laced a mustard jar with poison, leading to at least one man becoming seriously ill. With Molly out of the way, Young continued poisoning his father and sister, and this only stopped when Fred was hospitalised in May 1962 after his attacks of vomiting and cramping became increasingly severe. Tests were run, and Fred was found to have been poisoned over months with antimony, and he was believed to be one dose away from death. However, Fred still appeared unable or unwilling to believe his son was to blame. It was his school that finally raised the alarm, after a teacher found vials of poison in his desk. The school had Young interviewed by a psychiatrist, posing as a careers advisor, and it became clear that Young was obsessed with poisons and had clearly used these substances to harm others. The school called the police, and on the 23rd of May 1962, Graham Young was arrested when he returned home from school. When Graham Young was arrested in May 1962, he was found in possession of vials of poison in his school blazer, and he freely admitted, apparently with great pride, to having poisoned his father, sister, a school friend, and his stepmother Molly, and that he deliberately administered a lethal dose to the latter, resulting in her death. Due to the cremation of Molly's body, there was no way to verify his claims that he had murdered her, and therefore he couldn't be charged with this. Instead, he was charged with 3 counts of, quote, malicious administration of a noxious thing to inflict grievous bodily harm. In July 1962, Graham Young appeared at the Old Bailey in London, where he pleaded guilty to the charges
and was assessed by psychiatrists. One, Dr. Christopher Fish, testified in court that Young was a psychopath who had failed to, quote, develop a normal moral sense, and he felt that Young was extremely likely to reoffend. He also recounted a conversation with Young where he was unconcerned about the damage he had caused, but instead was upset about being unable to get his hands on his vials of poison, with him saying, quote, "I'm missing my antimony. I miss the power it gives me." The recommendation was that Graham Young should be sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital and remain there for a term of at least 15 years, with his release back into the community only being directed if he was no longer deemed a danger to society. So, at the age of just 14 years old, Graham Young became one of the youngest patients to ever enter Broadmoor. Interesting fact, the youngest patient ever to enter Broadmoor was a person called William Giles, who was sent there at the age of 10 in 1885.
After committing arson, he spent the rest of his life, 77 years in Broadmoor, dying there in 1962 aged 87. Graham Young is one of those rare people who is so dangerous there's literally no environment which can contain them and protect those around them. As an example, soon after coming to Broadmoor, a patient called John Berridge died an agonising death from cyanide poisoning. This was a man that Young had written about in his letters to his family, stating that John was annoying him with his snoring. So, Young decided to eliminate the issue. He took laurel bush leaves, of which there were large amounts in the locality, and which naturally contained cyanide, extracted this, and then used it to poison John. Young freely confessed that he killed John to staff at Broadmoor, but for some inexplicable reason, they marked his death as a suicide. I imagine this was just to avoid the hassle of an inquiry. However, this was not an isolated incident. On one occasion, bleach was found in staff's coffee, and in 1968, so 6 years into Graham Young's stay, industrial cleaner was found to have gone missing. This was found in the communal tea urn used by approximately 100 people, but luckily before anyone had drunk from it. It appears that both staff and patients knew full well what Young was doing, and it stated that staff would jokingly tell patients, quote, "Unless you behave, I'll let Graham make your coffee." Young was also still fascinated with Nazism and walk around Broadmoor adorned with swastikas he'd made, including pendants and medallions. He would also continue to espouse the virtues of Hitler. Despite his behaviour in Broadmoor, including him confessing that he killed a fellow patient, his original suggested tariff of 15 years, and the fact that he clearly tried to poison others over the years, in 1970, Broadmoor psychiatrist Dr. Edgar Udwin wrote to the Home Secretary and recommended that Graham Young should be released, as he was no longer a danger to society and, quote, no longer obsessed with poisons, violence, and mischief. Cynically, I think this bizarre decision was potentially due to the fact that Young was causing so many issues in Broadmoor, and they just wanted to get rid of him. Or perhaps Dr. Udwin was really crap at his job. Either way, in early 1971, after 8 years in Broadmoor, and aged just 23, this dangerous psychopath was released from Broadmoor. Just prior to his release, he told a nurse, quote, "When I get out, I'm going to kill one person for every year I've spent in this place." This comment was considered a serious threat, noted down and put in Young's file, but was never acted upon. If you think that this is a calamity of failures, what happened next is even more staggering. As soon as Graham Young was released in early 1971, he appeared to go on a journey down memory lane, going to chemists that he bought poison from and proudly stating his name, and appearing to be disappointed when they did not receive him as some sort of celebrity. Similarly, Young approached his old school teachers and spoke to them about his time away, focusing more on telling them about his crimes as opposed to his rehabilitation. Again, Young appeared unhappy that he was not more infamous and that the world had apparently continued turning despite his absence. Within weeks of his release, Young had purchased his favourite poisons, thallium and antimony, from a chemist and began to poison people. He began with 34-year-old Trevor Speaks, who was a housemate at a hostel he was staying at in Slough, Berkshire. Soon after Young moved in, Trevor began to experience abdominal pains and sickness whenever he drank anything.
Young said a glass of wine would help his symptoms, but this only made the sickness worse. Trevor survived, but had severe abdominal pains for years. Around this same time, another man, whose name I cannot find, apparently had a drink with a man who looked exactly like Graham Young and who was obsessed with poisons. This man apparently became severely ill but survived, but eventually, years later, committed suicide because of the ongoing severe pain he experienced from being poisoned. In May 1971, Graham Young moved to Hertfordshire and applied for a job at a small firm called John Hadland Limited in the village of Bovington, which made photographic lenses. The company contacted Broadmoor for references and were apparently informed that Young was rehabilitated. However, Broadmoor did not tell the company that Young was a convicted poisoner, had admitted killing a fellow patient, and had made threats to kill people when he got out, so he was hired. Young's job included making and distributing hot drinks, and each employee had their own mug, so it was easier for him to target specific individuals. Young was described as a morose, unsociable man who would only become involved in conversations if they were on topics he was interested in, specifically war, Nazis, poison, and famous murderers. Aside from these interactions, he would keep himself to himself and barely speak to anyone unless he absolutely had to. Immediately, Young began poisoning his co-workers. Young began to poison 59-year-old Bob Eagle, his immediate superior. Bob was a World War II veteran and, within days of first meeting Young, had to take time off work with diarrhea, vomiting, and severe stomach pains. Bob's health improved when he left to go on holiday, but when he returned, as with his stepmother Molly all those years ago, Graham Young laced Bob's tea with a fatal dose of thallium. Bob's condition deteriorated quickly, resulting in him having profuse vomiting and diarrhea, as well as extreme pain in his abdomen and back. Bob was admitted to hospital and transferred to the intensive care unit. However, his organs shut down, and Bob died an agonizing death on the 7th of July 1971. His death was not considered suspicious. The callousness of Graham Young is demonstrated by his feigned concern for Bob, with him regularly calling the hospital to get updates on his condition. I have no doubt that this was his way of getting a sick thrill by getting updates about the agony that Bob was in and how his life was ebbing away. Young also poisoned at least 4 other co-workers, with his modus operandi being to slip poison into their tea or coffee. One of these people, Diana Smith, was poisoned when Young spiked her tea. Later, police found a diary entry where Young had written that Diana had, quote, "irritated me yesterday, so I packed her off home with an attack of sickness. I only gave her something to shake her up. I now regret that I didn't give her a larger dose, capable of laying her up for a few days." Unfortunately, Young was able to avoid detection because, coincidentally, a stomach bug had been going around the local area, known as the, quote, Bovington bug, so it was assumed that the employees falling ill had succumbed to this virus. Before the truth could be revealed, 56-year-old local councillor and part-time employee at Hadland Limited, Fred Biggs, was targeted by Young, who began by slipping small doses of antimony into his drinks. Then, on the 30th of October 1971, Young put a massive dose of thallium into Fred's tea, and within 24 hours, he developed chest pains and had difficulty breathing. Fred was soon transferred to the intensive care unit in Whittington Hospital in North London, and his last few weeks on Earth were like something out of a nightmare. His nervous system began to shut down, so he could not speak or breathe on his own. He was in perpetual excruciating pain, and eventually, his skin began to peel off. Fred eventually died on the 17th of November 1971, and again, poisoning was not suspected. Young was again reveling in his offending, calling the hospital and even Fred's wife to get updates on his condition. As with other psychopaths and narcissists, Graham Young couldn't help but find some way to brag about his behaviour, and his own arrogance was his undoing. Specifically, the day after Fred's death, the company doctor gathered all the staff and tried to reassure them due to the number of illnesses and deaths the company had had in such a short time. The doctor became concerned when Young began grilling him about thallium poisoning. Young's demeanour and his apparent expansive knowledge of poisons raised alarm bells, and the police were called. The police then looked into the situation and quickly found that the deaths and illnesses had started soon after Graham Young had started the company. They consulted with doctors who stated that the symptoms of those who had died and come unwell was likely as a result of deliberate poisoning. They also saw Young's criminal record and could see the reasons why he'd been sent to Broadmoor. Only then were the company informed of who Graham Young really was, but obviously by that point it was far too late. The police knew they had their man, and when they searched Graham Young's flat, they had all the evidence they needed. In particular, the most incriminating piece of evidence was a meticulous diary that Young had kept, in which he documented the progress of his, quote, patients, including dosages he had given them and resulting symptoms. He also wrote whether he was going to allow his victims to live or die. Also found in his property was enough poison to kill in excess of 300 people. In addition, it was found that Young had adorned his walls with pictures of Hitler and other Nazi leaders, as well as drawings of emaciated figures holding bottles labelled poison, clutching their throats. On November the 21st, 1971, Graham Young was finally arrested. Young gleefully confessed to poisoning and killing Bob Eagle and Fred Biggs, as well as poisoning 2 other people. He bragged that he committed the, quote, perfect murder by killing his stepmother Molly Young in 1962. Young was eventually charged with multiple offences, including 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, and he was held in prison awaiting his day in court. So, remember, we had a psychiatrist who stated that Graham Young was no longer a danger to society, so he should be released. And, in less than 10 months, he'd poisoned numerous people and murdered at least 2, and no one bothered to tell his employers that he was a poisoner whose modus operandi was to lace people's drinks. Absolutely mind-boggling. The evidence against Graham Young was overwhelming, not only due to his own confession, but the poisons found in his property and the fact that subsequently, thallium had been found in the internal organs of Fred Biggs and the cremated remains of Bob Eagle. However, it was clear he was intent on enjoying the spotlight and so pleaded not guilty to all offences, resulting in him going to trial at St Albans Crown Court, which started on the 19th of June 1972. Young took the stand clearly as a way to demonstrate just how clever he was, and he assisted his defence in poking holes in the prosecution's case. It appears that Young potentially believed his own superiority and his lies, with him writing to a cousin stating, quote, I stand a good chance of acquittal, for the prosecution case has a number of inherent weaknesses. A strong point in my favour is that I am not guilty of the charges. To no one's surprise, Graham Young was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment. I cannot find whether a minimum tariff was set, but I think it's likely that authorities wanted him to die behind bars, which, eventually, he did. So, by the age of 25, Graham Young was again behind bars, this time unlikely ever to be released. He was dubbed the Teapot Poisoner by the press, and it's clear that he revelled in his notoriety and demanded recognition in prison. In prison, Young continued to espouse his love of Hitler and would often grow a moustache in honour of his idol. He was hated by other prisoners. The one person he bonded with was Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, with the pair apparently bonding over their love of the Nazis. It's clear that evil attracts evil, and despite the remorselessness of Graham Young's offending, Ian Brady wrote that, quote, it was difficult not to empathise with Graham Young. I cannot think of a worse pairing than Ian Brady and Graham Young. The only positive of this story is that neither are amongst the living any longer. With Graham Young, on August the 1st, 1990, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight. He was 42 years old. The cause of death was determined to be a heart attack. However, Young had no history of heart disease, which led people to speculate that his death was suspicious and that he may have been killed by other inmates or staff. However, I think a more likely conclusion is that Young found a way to poison himself, ending his own life in order to escape justice.
his last act of control. This is a fascinating case, as I don't think I've covered many people as cold and remorseless as Graham Young, and definitely not a case involving poison. Graham Young was, in my humble opinion, the epitome of a psychopath, a man who had no empathy or conscience for what he did. Young is, in many respects, an easier case to understand, as he made his motivation to the thinking quite obvious, with him stating, as already said, that he missed the power that the poisons gave him. And another insightful quote came from his final arrest where, when asked how he could justify killing human beings, he stated, quote, "I suppose I'd ceased to see them as people. At least, a part of me had. They were simply guinea pigs." Taking these comments together, I believe that Graham Young saw himself as some sort of god, and mere mortals akin to rats running around a maze, with him in ultimate control of their fate and destiny. Young saw himself as superior to everyone, and those around him as annoyances to be experimented upon and disposed of when they became an inconvenience. I think that Young's early fascination with Hitler and Nazis was driven by the sense of power that one man can have, and how this can be bent to kill others on a mass scale, and he was trying to replicate the behaviour of his idol, including dressing like him and even growing a similar moustache. He also replicated the mass extermination technique used by this regime. In terms of poisoning, I think that Graham Young probably thought he was born out of his time, and that he wished that he'd been born in a different time, in a different country, where he'd have willingly volunteered to be part of the final solution. However, as just one man, it's clear that Graham Young was intent on maiming and killing as many people as possible. Anyone was fair game, either his family members, and anyone who simply annoyed Young, even for the most trivial of reasons, including snoring, was deemed worthy of execution. It's clear that, whilst overestimating his intelligence, Graham Young had an astute intellect, and I think this is demonstrated by the nature of his offending, with him using poison, which needs skill to administer stealthily, and it's clear he administers specific dosages depending on whether he wished to maim or kill. I imagine that Young felt ecstatic about how he was getting away with his crimes, how he was hiding in plain sight, and no one was any the wiser. I mentioned during the intro of this video that Young had killed at least 4 people, including his stepmother, a patient in Broadmoor, as well as the 2 workers at his last place of employment. However, how many people he actually killed is unclear, as it seems that the cause of death of all of the people he murdered were linked to natural causes until Young confessed. Clearly, as with the typical narcissist, Graham Young wanted praise and recognition for the work that he'd done, and I imagine he was holding back information to drip feed over the years whilst in prison. Maybe Graham Young wasn't getting the recognition he wanted and had become inconsequential, just another prisoner in the system, and that's why he took his own life. Or potentially he did indeed die of natural causes, but I find this unlikely. But, regardless of the nature of his passing, it's clear that Graham Young was an extremely dangerous and evil man, devoid of any humanity. Wednesday the 13th of March 1986 was any other school day at Dunblane Primary School in Dunblane, near Stirling in Scotland, but all that changed just after 9:30 a.m. when Thomas Hamilton, a 43-year-old paedophilic loner, walked into the school with 4 handguns and began firing. In less than 5 minutes, he murdered 17 people, including 16 children, with the oldest being 6 years old, in a case of mass murder which shocked the country and which has become known as the Dunblane Massacre. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Thomas Hamilton was born on the 10th of May 1952 in Glasgow, Scotland. He had a confusing childhood, with him finding out that his older sister Agnes was in fact his mother, and that the people he thought were his parents were in fact his grandparents, and that his real father had abandoned him when he was only 18 months old. How this affected Hamilton is unclear, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that it led to a lifelong mistrust of others and perpetual anger about his lot in life. Hamilton grew up to be an unpleasant, petulant man, described as, quote, a loner, and, quote, weirdo, by those who knew him. He appeared to have 2 obsessions: clubs attended by young boys and guns. With regards to the former obsession, Hamilton was heavily involved in the Scout movement in Scotland from a young age, and, by his early 20s, was a Scout leader.
However, in 1974, aged 22, he was removed from this position due to concerns about his behaviour around the boys in his charge. This initially doesn't seem to have been sexual in nature, but more his reckless disregard for their welfare. It appears that the incidents which led to him being removed from the Scouts were 2 weekend trips in 1974, where Hamilton lied and said that he had booked a hostel for him and 8 boys to stay at. However, in fact the children slept in Hamilton's van in extremely cold conditions. However, nothing was ever Hamilton's fault, and any time he was disciplined or removed from a position, he would gripe to the authorities, writing long letters to anyone who would listen about how hard done by he was. Hamilton was undeterred and set up his own, quote, boys' clubs. He would hire out halls at various schools in and around the Dunblane area for activities. Each club would see 50 to 70 boys attending. It was here that there were significant concerns about Hamilton's behaviour around these children, with him apparently telling the boys to take their shirts off, under the guise of wishing to observe their physical fitness levels. Hamilton would also run summer camps, where it's claimed that he would encourage the boys to walk around naked and rub suntan lotion into his body. Hamilton would also take pictures of the boys when they were bare-chested, and apparently made no attempts to hide his behaviour, with people who peered in the window of Hamilton's property noticing these pictures hung all over his wall. Whilst Hamilton was never prosecuted for any offences, police received at least 10 complaints about his behaviour towards these young boys and his attention towards them. Hamilton seemed obsessed with being around young male children, and so, as each one of his clubs was shut down due to concerns, he would simply ask another local authority for permission to set up somewhere else. Between 1981 and 1996, Thomas Hamilton ran at least 20 of these so-called boys' clubs. This behaviour, coupled with his possessing these pictures of children, leave me in no doubt that Thomas Hamilton was a paedophile who had a sexual interest in young male children. Hamilton was extremely litigious, and every time an allegation was made about him, he would begin bombarding councils and MPs with letters stating how everyone was slandering him and how unfairly he was being treated. However, remember, this is a man who's claiming that all accusations are malicious, but you could see pictures of shirtless boys on his wall if you went to his house. It's clear that Hamilton was a man who expected everything his way. He wants to be around young boys for his own sexual gratification and would not accept anyone trying to stop him. He couldn't give a shit about the welfare of the children or the fact that parents were trying to protect their children. No, Thomas Hamilton believed he was entitled to act in any way he wanted. Clearly, he saw nothing wrong with his behaviour. Behind closed doors, Hamilton was also a monster and a bully towards his own family members. It was revealed after the massacre that he would bully and abuse his aging grandfather, regularly shouting at him and urinating in his drinks, taking great pleasure in torturing the man. It appears that everyone in Hamilton's world was just there for him to use and abuse, and nothing was standing in his way. And there was one incident which epitomised how he dealt with people who challenged him. Specifically, in the early 90s, a mother of one of the children at his clubs had gone to the police to complain about his behaviour. Hamilton stopped outside the woman's house and confronted her, saying that he'd heard that she'd called him a pervert. Hamilton then pulled a gun from under his seat, pointed it at her, and said it was loaded. The Dunblane massacre led to a crackdown on the possession of handguns in the UK. But before this incident, certain handguns were legal to privately own, and Hamilton was obsessed with collecting and displaying his collection of firearms. 4 of these weapons he would use on the day of the murders. Hamilton would apparently talk to his guns, cooing over them as if they were children. I think guns represented power to Hamilton and made him feel less like a sad, little man. So, you had a recipe for disaster. You had a man who was obsessed with guns, had a perverted fascination with small children, and a persecution complex against a society that he saw was getting in the way of what he rightfully thought he was entitled to. In the years leading up to the massacre, Hamilton's complaints to everyone and anyone who would read them were becoming more frequent and unhinged, and it's clear he was becoming more angry and more unstable. Hamilton also appeared to be blaming the rumours about him, rather than his own behaviour, on his kitchen fitting business suffering. Word to the wise: if you want people to let you into their home to fit a kitchen, stop taking pictures of their children. In early 1996, Hamilton was again sending more deranged letters to various people, complaining about his apparent persecution, and it's in these communications that his specific disdain for Dunblane Primary School is revealed. In a letter written to a member of the local education authority in January 1996, Hamilton wrote, quote, "At Dunblane Primary School, where teachers have contaminated all the older boys with this poison, even former cleaners and dinner ladies have been told by teachers at the school that I am a pervert. There have been reports at many schools of our boys being rounded up by staff, and even warnings given to entire schools by head teachers during assembly." One of his last letters, sent on March 7th, 1996, just 6 days before the massacre, was sent to Queen Elizabeth, with Hamilton again moaning about how persecuted he was. The letter concludes with the following paragraphs, quote, "I've been involved with the organisation of boys' sports clubs for over 20 years, and the rumours circulated by officials of the Scout Association have now reached epidemic proportions across Central Region. As well as my personal distress and loss of public standing, this situation has also resulted in loss of my business and ability to earn a living. Indeed, I cannot even walk the streets for fear of embarrassing ridicule. All of this and more has been caused by the maladministration of the Scout Association and their denial of natural justice and duty of care. To some Scout officials, it was simply a ruse to oust a rival group. I turn to you as a last resort and am appealing for some sort of intervention in the hope that I may be able to regain my self-esteem in society. I am your obedient servant, Thomas W. Hamilton." I'm not sure what's more delusional, the fact that Hamilton couldn't see any issue with his behaviour and thought it was just a way for them to get rid of a, quote, rival, or the fact that he thought that he was that important that Queen Elizabeth would intervene. However, aside from writing letters, evidence was uncovered after the massacre which indicated that Hamilton may have been planning his crimes for 2 years before he acted. In particular, there was some evidence that Hamilton had been interrogating the children at his clubs about the layout and the timetable at Dunblane Primary School, and in particular which times and days had occurrences where the most number of children were gathered in one place. From these inquiries, Hamilton learned that on Wednesdays there was a school assembly, and then the Year 1 children, aged 5 to 6 years old, went straight to their PE class at the gym, with him finding out the location of this room. It's clear that Hamilton was planning an event which, in his twisted mind, would punish society for trying to stop him from indulging his sexual attraction to small boys. At 8:40 a.m. on the 16th of March 1996, Thomas Hamilton was seen scraping ice off his van. This was the last sighting of him prior to his rampage. Hamilton then loaded the van with 4 handguns, including 2 9mm Browning HP pistols and 2 .357 Magnum revolvers. He also brought with him 743 rounds of ammunition and ear protectors. At 9:30 a.m, Hamilton parked his van near to a telegraph pole and cut the wires, I assumed stock calls to the police. He then armed himself and walked around to the front of the school. This map showed his route. It's clear that he knew exactly where he was going, with his ultimate destination being the gym at the back of the school. In the gym, just starting their PE lesson, was teacher Gwen Mayer and her 28 Year 1 pupils, aged between 5 and 6 years old. Also in the room were PE teacher Eileen Harold and Mary Blake, a teaching assistant. When Hamilton reached the gym, he began to fire rapidly and randomly aiming at anything that moved. Eileen Harold and Mary Blake were both shot, but they survived and managed to barricade themselves in a store cupboard with several wounded children. Gwen Mayer was shot and killed instantly whilst trying to protect the children. Hamilton fired 29 shots, killing one child instantly and wounding several others. He then fired another 14 shots before approaching wounded children and firing 16 point-blank shots into them. An 11-year-old pupil was walking around the outside of the gym when he heard screaming and loud bangs. The child looked in and Hamilton fired at him, missing him, but the child was injured with flying glass before he ran away. Hamilton then fired 24 shots in various directions, including targeting people who were walking or running past. Hamilton then left the gym and fired another 4 rounds towards the library, hitting and injuring another member of staff. Hamilton was standing in an area surrounded by classrooms, and he fired 9 bullets into a room of 11-year-olds who were cowering on the floor with their teacher. 1 bullet hit a chair where a child had been sitting just seconds before. Hamilton then walked back into the gym, took out one of the revolvers he was carrying, put it in his mouth, and pulled the trigger, killing himself instantly. The massacre lasted between 3 to 4 minutes, during which time Hamilton had fired approximately 100 rounds of ammunition, which killed 1 adult and 15 children instantly, with a further one dying on the way to hospital. He also injured 15 others, the majority of these being children. Emergency services were on the scene quickly, and those who could be saved were rushed to hospital. The news spread quickly, and terrified parents descended on Dunblane Primary School, hoping that their children were not amongst the dead. I cannot imagine the horror that the emergency services must have witnessed on that day, and the devastation of the parents of these children, who had likely only seen them an hour before, and were having to come to terms with the fact that their angels had been murdered in a place they should have felt completely safe. I want to talk about the victims of this horrific event, but refuse to mention the name of this piece of shit in the section where I'm going to do this. I refuse to sully their memory by mentioning his name in any sentence where I mention theirs, so I'm doing this bit first. I've already outlined the broad strokes of the man I believe Thomas Hamilton was: a paedophile, narcissist, who believed he should be allowed to do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. A deranged, self-absorbed loser whose one benefit to society was removing himself from it. Weirdly, I misspelt the word narcissist when writing this script, and the spelling suggestion was Antichrist. I wouldn't disagree with this characterization. Hamilton clearly believed that society needed to pay for how they'd apparently treated him, and he targeted children, I believe, knowing full well that there is no greater loss to a parent than losing their child, and this was his twisted way at getting back at society, by murdering children who had done nothing to him, had no idea who he was, and who had barely started their lives. There is something so evil and psychopathic in Hamilton's actions, with him knowing full well that there would be defenseless 5- and 6-year-old children in that gym, and planning their slaughter, including standing over them while they were injured and shooting them at point-blank range. Thomas Hamilton was a coward, shown not only by his actions but also by the fact he killed himself. This seems to be the eventual actions of most mass shooters, and I believe it's the ultimate fuck you to society. It's them saying, look at what I've done, and now I'm going to leave you without any answers and no peace. I go out on my terms. The truth is, these cowards are too weak to take responsibility for their actions, knowing they could not justify the unjustifiable and would rot in prison, reviled by society. I'm not overly religious, but for Hamilton, I hope there is a hell, and he will be tormented for the rest of eternity. Please feel free to give me your thoughts on the mind and motivations of Thomas Hamilton. The nation was in shock as a result of the massacre at Dunblane Primary School, and it understandably dominated the headlines for weeks. Changes were made quickly in the aftermath, including a ban on private ownership of handguns, and the gym where the children their teachers died was torn down. I remember the day this happened and the days afterwards. Although I was only young, I knew that this was something really bad, an example of pure evil. I remember specifically that there was a prayer published in one of the newspapers with all the names of the children and their teacher that died, and I said that prayer every day for months afterwards, hoping that God would hear me. I don't remember all of it, but 26 years later, I still recall how it ended, with it saying, "Safe with Jesus, safe above. Please accept our nation's love." Now, as I did back then, I want to say each of their names, and I want to show you pictures of each of them, showing you the beautiful children they were, so that they are remembered. Gwen Mayer, age 45 years old, the teacher who tried to protect her children. Abigail McLellan, age 5. Victoria Clydesdale, age 5. Sophie North, age 5. Ross Irvine, aged 5. Mari McBeath, aged 5. Melissa Curry, aged 5. Megan Turner, aged 5. Kevin Hassel, aged 5. John Petrie, aged 5. Joanna Ross, aged 5. Hannah Scott, aged 5. Emma Crozier, aged 5. Emily Morton, aged 5. David Kerr, aged 5. Charlotte Dunn, aged 5. Brett McKinnon, aged 6 years old. Robert Maudsley is one of the longest-serving prisoners in the UK and considered one of the most dangerous. For the last 44 years, Maudsley has been in solitary confinement, 39 of these in a purpose-built glass cage underneath H&P Wakefield, one of the most high-security prisons in the country, where he's not allowed contact with any other prisoners, and during the 1 hour he is allowed out each day, he's escorted by at least 4 to 6 prison officers. The reason for this is that Maudsley is a serial killer who has killed 4 people, 3 of them in prison. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Robert Maudsley was born on the 26th of June 1953 in Liverpool, UK. He was one of 12 children, with their father being a lorry driver, also called Robert, and his wife Jean. It appears that Maudsley's home life was hellish, and when he was 21 months old, he and some of his siblings were taken into care due to parental neglect. Maudsley and his siblings spent time in an orphanage being cared for by nuns, and it appears that this was the only period of stability in his life. During this time, unlike other children, Maudsley did not receive visits from his parents, and in some respects this was probably a good thing, as it gave him some distance from the abuse he had suffered. Unfortunately, at age 8, Maudsley was returned to the family home and continued to be abused by his father. One of his siblings later stated, quote, "It was just the old fella who hit us with his fists, belt and sometimes a stick, but our ma instigated half of it." Maudsley himself said, quote, "All I remember of my childhood is the beatings. Once I was locked in a room for 6 months and my father only opened the door to come in and beat me 4 or 6 times a day." It appears that Maudsley was singled out from his siblings for the worst of the abuse, and he claimed this included being sexually abused by his father. Maudsley alone was then taken back into care, with his parents telling his siblings that he was dead, so essentially cutting him off from any support. In around 1969, at age 16, Maudsley went to London and drifted around the city. He developed a drug habit and attempted suicide on numerous occasions, ending up in various psychiatric facilities where he expressed thoughts of killing his parents. In order to fund his drug habit, Maudsley committed some offences, but also worked as a rent boy, exchanging money for his sexual services. It was when working as a rent boy in 1974 that Maudsley met his first victim, a labourer called John Farrell, in Wood Green in North London. On March 14, 1974, Farrell engaged the services of Maudsley, and after they'd had sex, Maudsley claimed that Farrell showed him pictures of children he'd abused. Maudsley then took a length of cord and strangled Farrell to death. Maudsley surrendered himself to police, admitted what he'd done, and told them that he needed psychiatric care. Maudsley was found unfit to stand trial and, at the age of 21, was instead sent to Broadmoor. Broadmoor, or to give it its full name Broadmoor Hospital, is, as the name suggests, actually run by the National Health Service, and its role, like other psychiatric units, is to treat the mentally ill. However, Broadmoor is a high-security facility due to only admitting the most dangerous types of individuals who pose the gravest threat to themselves or others. Due to this, Broadmoor's 284 beds are mainly occupied by people who have come from prison, the courts or police stations, having either been convicted or awaiting trial for or arrested for extremely serious offences. On very rare occasions, Broadmoor admits people have not committed any crimes yet, but are considered a danger of committing serious offences imminently. As it is a hospital, residents are known as patients, and the average stay at Broadmoor is 5 years, although some residents can spend the rest of their lives there. Once deemed well enough, the patient can then be transferred out, whether this be back to prison or to stand trial, etc. Although it's a hospital, Broadmoor's level of security is in line with a maximum security prison, including anti-escape measures, including rows of fencing, security cameras at a 20-foot surrounding wall. Anyway, also resident in Broadmoor with Maudsley was David Cheeseman, a man with a history of violence, including attempting to murder a worker at another high-security psychiatric facility by hitting them over the head with a metal bar. Another patient was David Alan Francis, a convicted child molester. On the 26th of February 1977, when Maudsley was 23 years old, he and Francis played football whilst Cheeseman watched. After the game, Cheeseman asked a male nurse to open a door where they could change out of their football boots, and the three of them went inside. When the nurse went to follow them inside, Maudsley pushed the door closed, and Cheeseman barricaded the door with a footlocker. The pair then tied up Francis and proceeded to assault and torture him over the next 9 hours, before finally strangling him to death. Maudsley had armed himself with a sharpened spoon, and he rammed this into Francis's ears so hard it went into his brain. When they finally killed him, Francis's body was held up and displayed to hospital staff who were able to peek in but not enter. Eventually, Maudsley and Cheeseman let them in to a sight of absolute horror. Francis's head had been, quote, split open, exposing his brain, which had the sharpened spoon stuck in it. Whilst this mode was horrific enough, there was a rumour that the spoon found in Francis's head was due to Maudsley trying to eat his brain, which then, through Chinese whispers, turned to the fact they had in fact done this and consumed other parts of Francis's body. However, this has been proven incorrect, but didn't stop Maudsley being dubbed the, quote, British Hannibal Lecter, after the famous antagonist of the Silence of the Lambs book and film. Curiously, whilst found unfit to stand trial after the first murder, Maudsley was considered competent to stand trial for the murder of Francis and was convicted, before being sent to Wakefield Maximum Security Prison in West Yorkshire, dubbed the Monster Mansion, due to the number of high-risk sexual and violent offenders who were held there. On the afternoon of July the 29th, 1978, Maudsley, now 25 years old, killed 2 prisoners in the space of an hour in Wakefield Prison. Maudsley later stated he intended to kill 7 people that day. The first victim was a man named Sawney Darwood, who was serving a life sentence for murdering his wife. Maudsley apparently knew Darwood for some time, as Darwood was teaching him French. Maudsley advised him into his cell, and then attacked him, stabbing and hacking at him with a makeshift dagger and strangling him. Maudsley then hid the body under the bed in his cell. Maudsley then tried to lure other prisoners into the cell, but none of them would enter, so he went out looking for another victim. He's described as, quote, lurking on the prison wing, when he came across William Roberts, a man serving a sentence for sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl who was lying on the bed in his cell. Maudsley attacked Robert, hacking him with the same dagger and smashing his head against the wall until he was dead. Maudsley then calmly walked up to a prison officer, dropped the bloody weapon on the table, and told them they would be too short at the next roll call. During his hearing for this double murder in 1979, the court heard that during his crimes Maudsley believed his victims were his parents. The killings, his lawyers argued, were the result of pent-up aggression resulting from a childhood of near constant abuse, with them stating that Maudsley had said, quote, when I kill, I think I have my parents in mind. Maudsley also apparently said, quote, if I had killed my parents in 1970, none of these people need have died. Maudsley was returned to Wakefield Prison and kept in solitary confinement and, as his picture shows, his movements outside of his cell were shadowed by prison officers. He gave one interview where the only pictures of him are taken from, and again, as you can see from this picture, he's surrounded by prison staff. In 1983, Maudsley was deemed to be too high a risk to other prisoners. It was decided he needs to be permanently housed away from them. So a separate prison cell was built in the basement of Wakefield Prison, essentially a prison within a prison. There are no pictures of this cell, but it's described as being 18 foot by 15 foot,
or 5.5 metres by 4.6 metres, with walls being made of bulletproof glass so it could be observed from all angles. Within the cell itself is a table and chair, both made out of compressed cardboard, with the bed being a slab of concrete, and a toilet and sink which are bolted to the floor.
In order to actually get to the area where he's housed, requires going through multiple security doors. Once at the cell, there's essentially an airlock which has to be gone through in order to stand face to face with Maudsley, being separated by more bulletproof glass, with there being a slot through which his meals and other items are passed to him. Maudsley is watched by officers 24 hours a day. He is allowed out of his cell once a day, but is escorted to an exercise yard by between 4 to 6 prison officers. This cell is described as closely resembling that of Hannibal Lecter in the film The Silence of the Lambs, but Maudsley's current accommodation was built 8 years before this film was released. The combination of the layout of Maudsley's cell and previous erroneous reports about him eating part of his victims has continued to fuel the perception of him as being the British Hannibal Lecter. However, Thomas Harris, the author of the books, has never stated the character or his prison cell was inspired in any way by Maudsley. Robert Maudsley is now 69 years old, has spent the last 44 years in solitary confinement, 39 of these in his specially constructed cell, where he will remain until the end of his life. I want to preface this part of the video by saying that overall I don't support solitary confinement. It's obviously an extreme measure which causes significant emotional and psychological harm and is sometimes used as a way to simply torment others. An example is the recent unrest in Myanmar, with politicians held in these conditions after the military coup in 2021. However, I'm struggling not to think that in some cases there's little other choice when it comes to extremely dangerous offenders. Maudsley's prolonged solitary confinement has been in the news on and off over the years, including in the year 2000, when Maudsley petitioned the courts for a relaxation of his conditions or, if this was refused, access to lethal drugs to end his life. At the same time, Maudsley was in correspondence with a journalist from the Times newspaper and wrote the following letter, quote, "How did I find myself in permanent solitary confinement at Wakefield? I first killed a man outside and found myself in Broadmoor. I then killed a fellow patient at Broadmoor and eventually found my way to Wakefield, where I killed 2 fellow inmates. It's on my record that I served numerous periods of solitary confinement at Broadmoor prior to killing a fellow patient. It's also on my record that I underwent a long period of solitary confinement in various prisons prior to my arrival at Wakefield and placement on normal location. At no time in Broadmoor or those prisons did I receive any kind of psychological or psychiatric assistance or help." Numerous national newspapers and tabloids have labelled me Britain's own Hannibal Lecter, etc. All very sensational, no doubt, and I've received numerous letters from people over the years who have watched this film Silence of the Lambs and who believe it's a genuine portrayal of my life story. They are of course entitled to their beliefs, however a more accurate portrayal will be a film called Murder in the First. I mention this because an important question for these people to ask would be, to what extent my conditions and environment and treatment at Broadmoor and HP Wakefield played in causing me to react in such a savage manner. As you know, I don't see any psychologists nor any psychiatrists currently. It seems Wakefield is happy to place me in permanent solitary confinement after killing 2 of its prisoners. Actually, all Wakefield has sought to do since 1978 is to demonise me. He also wrote, quote, "Do we all not form our opinions, beliefs, etc. from how we perceive that environment? Wakefield prison authorities perceive me as a problem. Their solution to that problem to date has been in fact to bury me alive. The cage ultimately for them being my concrete coffin, but is that the final solution? What purpose is being served by keeping me locked up 23 hours a day? Why even bother to feed me and to give me 1 hour's exercise a day, month and year, yet not allow me to talk to any other inmates via their windows? Who am I actually a risk to?" Let me try to briefly answer that by saying I killed rapists, paedophiles and sex offenders. No other type of person nor other type of offender. So my past crime strongly suggests this is the group most and solely at risk. Why is this? I can say that yes, I've been raped, and yes, I've been sexually abused by such people, and consequently, I do detest these people enough to have killed them in the past. I have no previous convictions for killing prison officers, and I have no previous convictions for seriously wounding nor stabbing any prison officers, and I cannot perceive nor can I imagine any situation in which this would arise. Maudsley also told the reporter that he'd asked the courts for a budgie, and that he would take care of it and, quote, "not eat it." The Times article I read from this time is very sympathetic to Maudsley and his living conditions, and the apparent inhumanity of his situation. I looked online at various message boards and comments in response to this article and other articles about Maudsley and his living situation,
and there seem to be a lot of people who perceive him as a hero, with them stating that he only killed child sex offenders, so what's the problem? These also seem to be mixed with general anti-establishment messages, including this one from 2000, which I found particularly odd to say the least. This comment describes Maudsley as, quote, a truly superior, insightful, brilliant, soul-alive philosopher. It goes further by stating, quote, I honour Robert's choice to speak out to the media and condemn the brutalisation, the inhumanity with which he has been treated. 46-year-old Robert is one of only 26 UK prison inmates who've been sentenced to life in prison with no chance of ever being released. Now Robert is demanding to be treated as a human being, or else he says he'd rather be murdered by the state. All he wants is to be treated as any human being in the 21st century deserves, at the very least. His voice, as published in the letter excerpts, is a cry of sanity in an insane society. In a sane society, 1 million people in England would rise up as one, together, and demand this tortured child victim, who has been unjustly tormented by society for his entire life, be finally treated as a victim worthy of limitless apology, affection, understanding, support, and only benevolent, never punitive treatment. It continues, quote, I honour your martyrdom, Robert. If there was any justice in the world, you would have a thermonuclear bomb capable of destroying all of humanity in your hands with the launch codes, and you yourself would be asked to decide whether the human race deserves to continue to exist. You're entitled to make this decision, Robert. You alone, based upon the unforgivable lifetime of unjust torment that your society initiated against you when you were a baby, has inflicted and continues to inflict upon you. Okay, that's an extreme example, but I think it illustrates my overall point that I think Maudsley's case has been romanticised to make him out to be some sort of vigilante who only targeted child sex offenders rather than a vicious, dangerous killer. Whilst Maudsley claimed that his first victim showed him images of sexual abuse and that's why he killed him, and 2 of his other 4 victims were sex offenders, one, Stanley Darwood, was in prison for murder, and Maudsley seemed to have no problem with interacting with him before that to learn French. This doesn't fit the pattern and strikes me as something personal. Also, Maudsley was described as quite prowling the wing looking for other people to kill. I think it's difficult not to conclude that he was simply looking for anyone to kill. It came across William Roberts, killing him simply because he was in his cell and available, rather than potentially anything to do with his offending. So, whilst it's clear that Maudsley has an understandable hatred of sex offenders, I think that potentially he was just wanting to kill as many people as possible for his own reasons, potentially because of the rage towards his parents and society, due to the fact that he felt victimised and abandoned. I don't believe that Maudsley did what he did to make society a better place. His actions are far more self-centred and selfish. Perhaps because of our natural revulsion of those who harm children, it's been twisted into something more poetic than it is. The question is really, would you trust Maudsley around your family? Was Maudsley failed by society? Quite possibly. However, while sympathetic to this, many people have horrific upbringings, but they don't then use this to justify taking the lives of others. Maudsley had opportunities to be within the general population in custody, but he used this to murder not 1, not 2, but 3 people. I know the tone of his letter was to try and plead his case and highlight the injustice of his situation, but I can't help but note the self-justification in his words, blaming others for his actions and appearing to link the conditions in Broadmoor and Wakefield directly to his criminality. However, it's a circular argument. He apparently blames Wakefield for him committing the offences, but feels aggrieved that they took issue with the fact that he then murdered 2 inmates, so he blames them for what happened and then blames them for the outcome. He states that Wakefield considers him a, quote, problem. Well, yes, because you killed other prisoners. Ultimately, I'm not sure what Maudsley expects. To be taken at his word that he would only kill certain types of people and therefore should be allowed out in the general population? How the prison service would even manage this is unclear. They would have to basically vet any prisoner who came anywhere near Maudsley to check their criminal record. However, what about someone he simply thinks is a child molester? Would he then kill them? Stripping away all the other details, Robert Maudsley killed 4 people, and therefore he's clearly a man who likes killing others for whatever reason, and who, because of this, the prison service had to build a specialist cell just for him and surround him with guards whenever he leaves it. In terms of being a martyr and tortured, it's clear that his basic needs are being met. He's sheltered and fed and is allowed out of his cell. The only thing missing is company, and Maudsley has ensured that's not possible due to killing those around him. However, it should be noted he does have visits from family members. To illustrate the continued danger of this man, more recently, in 2022, there was some publicity about letters Maudsley had written to his nephew,
in which he seems to have come to terms with being in solitary confinement, where he apparently spends his time playing video games, but he also disclosed that, if he was ever released, he would kill again. Mark Hobson was born on the 2nd of September 1969 in Wakefield, West Yorkshire in the UK. Hobson's childhood was described by friends as, quote, happy and stable, and he grew up with his parents Peter and Sandra and his two sisters Melanie and Leslie. The family eventually moved to Selby, North Yorkshire. However, despite apparently there being no issues in his childhood, Hobson soon began displaying extreme violence towards others, including in 1990 when he viciously attacked a girlfriend. In 1991, Hobson moved in with his childhood sweetheart Kay and her two children. The pair had a daughter together and married in 1993. Hobson worked at various jobs, including a landscape gardener and as a nightclub doorman in 1998. Hobson then, without any warning, informed Kay that he was leaving the marriage, and on the 1st of January 1999, he simply walked out of the family home. Kay later said, quote, there was no one else involved. He just didn't want married life anymore. It was bizarre. I couldn't believe it. He turned to pot and drinking heavily. He never drank when we were married, but now he got off his face. He became like a zombie. His life just went completely off the rails. Hobson's life indeed went off the rails, and he spent the next few years floating around, and his alcohol use and use of drugs, particularly cannabis, increased. Hobson was apparently soon drinking approximately 35 cans of strong beer a day. In March 2002, a man called William Brace was walking through Selby town centre when, across the road, he spotted his ex-girlfriend with Hobson. William was not too happy about this, his ex-girlfriend and his friend now going out, and so he went across the road to confront them. As he approached, William felt a pain in his stomach and believed that Hobson had punched him. However, when he noticed the blood, he realised he'd been stabbed. In quick succession, Hobson stabbed William a further 5 times in broad daylight in front of shocked passers-by. He used a box cutter that he'd taken from his place of work in a factory. William lay bleeding in the street, and Hobson was apparently enjoying watching him bleed to death. Despite significant blood loss and a punctured lung, William survived. Hobson was arrested and ended up in court, where he admitted to wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. In the UK, this is a serious offence, one step down from attempted murder. So you had an unprovoked attack with multiple stab wounds in broad daylight in front of numerous witnesses, and Hobson's punishment was, brace yourself, a 2-year probation order and 100 hours of community service. Mark Hobson should have received a significant custodial sentence for this incident, and had he would have been safely behind bars, and none of the horror that was about to take place would have happened. Claire Sanderson was aged 26 when she met Hobson, when they worked together at the same packaging plant in Selby in 2003. She had a twin sister called Diane. Claire and Hobson shared a mutual love of Tracy Chapman records and drinking, and they quickly became a couple, with people stating that Claire was, quote, smitten with Hobson. By April 2003, Claire had convinced her parents to lend her money for a deposit for a flat, and her and Hobson moved in together. However, Hobson began to demonstrate extreme violence towards Claire almost immediately, and he didn't care who saw what he was doing. On one occasion, a local man dragged Hobson off Claire when he was physically stood on her whilst holding a 12-inch butcher's knife to her neck. On another occasion, Hobson was seen punching Claire repeatedly in the face whilst holding her around the neck. Over the next year, Claire was the victim of repeated acts of violence, which resulted in the police being called on repeated occasions, but she appeared to be unable to give up on Hobson, with people stating that she, quote, followed him around like a lapdog. By the beginning of July 2004, Hobson was telling friends that he, quote, chose the wrong sister, and that he was going to, quote,
have Claire's twin sister Diane. On Sunday, the 11th of July 2004, Hobson put his plan to remove Claire and pursue Diane into action. In the evening of this day, Claire and Hobson spent time drinking in a pub before going back to their flat. When they returned, Hobson attacked Claire, hitting her 17 times in the head with a hammer, killing her. He then wrapped her body in bin bags and hid it in their bedroom. Claire's family noticed her absence quickly, and Hobson began stalling for time, telling them that Claire was sick or out visiting friends, but they were clearly becoming concerned. Little did they know that Hobson was planning his next murder and was reading survival manuals, anticipating that, when he was finished, he would need to go on the run. On the 17th of July 2004, 6 days after killing Claire, Hobson called her twin sister Diane and told her that Claire had glandular fever and was too ill to talk, but wanted her to visit. Diane left the home she shared with her mother and father and eagerly turned up. At 7:30 p.m, she stepped over the threshold into the flat, not knowing that her sister's body was wrapped in bin bags just up the stairs. Hobson then attacked her and, after hog-tying her, tortured her with scissors and razor blades to cut and stab her, including mutilating her genitals. She was also sexually assaulted, and he bit off her left nipple, which is believed that he swallowed. Hobson placed a bag over Diane's head and repeatedly beat her with a hammer. Eventually, Hobson strangled Diane to death. He then wrapped her body in bin bags and lay it next to that of her sister, whose body by now was starting to decompose. Diane's death was noticed almost immediately, as, after visiting her sister, she was meant to be going to meet her boyfriend at the pub. At approximately 8:45 p.m, the boyfriend, Ian Harrison, called Diane's mobile to find out where she was. Hobson answered the phone and made up a story that Claire and Diane's father, George Sanderson, had had a heart attack, so they had both rushed to be by his bedside. Ian was actually an old friend of Hobson's, so the pair arranged to meet at the pub instead. Hobson turned up, and he's described as being calm and showing absolutely no sign that he just viciously murdered Ian's girlfriend and now had 2 bodies in his bedroom. Remarkably, Hobson actually invited Ian to come back to the property. Why is unclear. Potentially he was intending to murder him, although he didn't eventually do this. When Ian turned up, he noticed an odd smell, which was the smell of Claire's decomposing body, which Hobson said was the drains, and he spotted blood on the sofa, which Hobson said was due to Claire's, quote, woman's problems. Hobson even invited Ian to stay the night, which he refused. When Ian used the toilet, Hobson stood behind him, and it was only later that Ian realised why, as this was to stop him from going into the bedroom, the room opposite, where the 2 bodies were lying on the floor. Ian went home, and by 7 a.m. the next morning, the 18th of July, he had still not heard from Diane and was beginning to worry. He went round to Diane's house, and when her father George opened the door in perfect health, he knew something was wrong. Ian and George went to Hobson's flat and forced entry. There, they found the mutilated and abused bodies of both women, but no sign of Hobson, who, by this point, had fled. The police were called, and they found evidence almost straight away which showed that the murders were premeditated, with them recovering a, quote, to-do list in the property. On it was a shopping list of items, including bin bags, duct tape, cable ties, fly spray, and air freshener, as well as a plan to lure Diane to the property, with, quote, use and abuse at will, being written by her name. Also written was a list of targets, including Diane and Claire's parents, as well as his ex-wife Kay. It was obvious who committed the murders, and the police began looking for Hobson, but unfortunately, by this point, he had already murdered 2 more people. After Ian had left the flat in the late evening of the 17th of July 2004, Hobson called his mother and claimed that,
Rather than being dead and their bodies wrapped up in the bedroom, Diane and Claire had been in a road traffic accident and had been badly injured and taken to hospital. Hobson asked for a lift to the hospital, which was in York. Hobson's mother picked him up and drove him the 15 miles to the hospital, arriving at around 2 a.m. on the 18th of July 2004. She then sat in the car park and Hobson went in. He returned a short time later and told his mother that the sisters were receiving treatment and that he was going to stay. Hobson's mother then drove off and assumed that her son would make his own way back later. Why Hobson went through this pantomime is unclear.
I assume it was to get out of the area without alerting his mother, but why did he want to go to this area specifically? We will never know. We also don't know what he did for the next few hours, but what we do know is that he travelled on foot to a small village called Strensall, which is about 6 miles away from the hospital. Living there were James Britton, aged 80, and his wife Joan, aged 81, a couple who'd been married for over 50 years and were enjoying their twilight years together. James had a condition similar to Parkinson's disease and was deaf and walked with a stick. Joan is described as being even more frail, and she too walked with a stick. At 8:55 a.m. on the 18th of July 2004, neighbours of the Brittons popped in to check on them and then left. Sometime between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m, Hobson broke into the property and attacked both James and Joan, beating them both with their own walking sticks. He then stabbed both of them. In the case of Joan, Hobson knocked her to the ground and stabbed her with such force that the blade went through her body and stuck in the floor underneath her. The blade then snapped off, so she was found in this state, the blade and the knife still in her body, when at 11:15 a.m, a neighbour again came to check on the couple and found a scene of absolute horror. The home had been ransacked, apparently due to Hobson looking for money. Hobson had made no real attempts to cover his tracks, and his fingerprints were found all over the property, including in the couple's blood. Police quickly attended and connected both crime scenes, and Mark Hobson became Britain's most wanted man.
Police quickly began running through the list of places that Hobson could have gone to ground, including his friends and family. What they didn't know was that Hobson was hiding out in some fields, approximately 5 miles outside of the outskirts of York, in a village called Shipton by Benningborough, apparently using the survival skills that he'd learned from various books he'd read. However, he was clearly no Bear Grylls, as Hobson soon ran out of water, and a week after the murders of James and Joan Britton, on the 25th of July 2004, Hobson walked into a petrol station to buy matches, cigarette papers, and a bottle of water. He was instantly recognised by staff at the petrol station, and the police were called. Armed police swarmed the area, and within minutes, Hobson was arrested. As he was led away, Hobson said to the police, quote, "I'm a fucking murderer, aren't I?" Mark Hobson admitted all 4 killings at court, and, on the 25th of May 2005, appeared for sentencing at Leeds Crown Court before Mr. Justice Grigson. Justice Grigson said, quote, "The enormity of what you've done is beyond words, and, quote, the damage you've done is incalculable. You have not only destroyed the lives of your victims, but you devastated the lives of those who loved them." Mark Hobson appeared to show no remorse for his actions. He then sentenced him. Mark Hobson was jailed for life and given a whole life tariff, meaning that he will never be released. In November 2005, Hobson appealed his sentence to the Court of Appeal, stating he should have got some credit for admitting to the murders at the first opportunity and not putting their families through the ordeal of a trial. This appeal was refused. Mark Hobson started his life in the town of Wakefield, and his life has come full circle, with him being sent to HMP Wakefield, a Category A prison I've mentioned on several occasions, as it's where the most dangerous criminals in the UK are held, and is dubbed the, quote, Monster Mansion. Hobson's guilty plea meant that he didn't have to give an explanation for his crimes in court. However, in 2006, it was revealed that Hobson had begun writing to a former friend called Donna Kempt, with her saying, quote, "He doesn't like to dwell on the past, but he said that he and Claire rowed on the day he killed her, and he flipped, and he went on to murder them all. It was the booze more than the drugs which sent him over the edge." Hobson reportedly told Donna, quote, "At first I couldn't remember what had happened. Now the memories are coming back, and they do haunt me." Hobson also boasted about how he'd passed his GCSE and A-level in maths, and quipped that one day he would have, quote, "more qualifications than Stephen Hawking." In response to these revelations, Ian Harrison, Diane's partner, stated, quote, "It doesn't matter how many qualifications he gets, he'll never be able to use them. He's never going to be released, and that is it. When he launched his appeal, that really set me back, but now at least I know he'll rot in jail, and when he's dead, he'll rot in hell." George Sanderson, Claire and Diane's father, stated, quote, "It doesn't matter what Hobson says, he's just pure evil. Alcohol doesn't make you do what he did. It's because he's such a twisted person. He can never say sorry to us. We can't even look at our daughter's photographs without thinking about what he did. It's too hard to even talk about it, and whatever he said won't make any difference." Almost 20 years after this horrific quadruple murder, Mark Hobson remains in prison, where he'll spend the rest of his miserable existence. When I was looking into Mark Hobson, I didn't find any indicators of abuse when he was growing up or exposure to violence. These are often factors which result in people developing pro-violent attitudes, which they then display later in their lives. However, just because it isn't obviously written somewhere doesn't mean it didn't happen, as there's likely some reason why Hobson developed to the monster he did, or perhaps he was simply born evil. However, what is clear is that he was trying to excuse his behaviour by saying, "The alcohol made me do it." George Sanderson hit the nail on the head when he said alcohol didn't make him do it, he was just a twisted person, and that's correct. Alcohol and drugs don't create violence, or everyone who used them would start acting in that way. Alcohol and drugs just lower people's inhibitions and allows them to more easily act on their pre-existing violent and aggressive attitudes. Hobson blaming his alcohol and drug use makes no sense. Okay, maybe he was under the influence when he killed Claire, but he planned the death of Diane and had thought through what he needed to conceal their bodies and stop the smell of decay. Instead, I think that Mark Hobson was a man who saw others merely as objects he could use and abuse, and when he got tired of them, he felt the right to simply dispose of them. With regards to Claire, Hobson clearly thought that she was his property, something he could victimise any way he wanted, and this included abusing her in the street in full view of members of the public. He believed that he picked the wrong sister, so rather than leaving Claire and potentially trying to begin a relationship with Diane, as a normal person might do, he decided to get rid of Claire entirely and kill her, like one would dispose of an item they no longer have a use for. However, Hobson wasn't interested in any sort of mutual relationship with Diane. He just wanted to use and abuse her, before again disposing of her like rubbish. I believe what likely happened was that Diane attended the property, Hobson tried to initiate some sort of sexual contact, she rejected him, and he decided that she needed to die. The deaths of James and Joan Britton were completely gratuitous. Both individuals were elderly, and if Hobson's intention was just to rob them, he could simply have threatened them and got what he wanted. Potentially because of their level of vulnerability, he could have just walked in and taken what he wanted, and walked out, knowing full well they couldn't fight back. However, I think he saw two vulnerable people that he could use and abuse, and that he killed them for kicks. He knew that, when he was caught, he'd be going to prison forever, so thought he would just cause as much chaos as possible. Mark Hobson is just a cowardly, evil man who has no consideration for the life of anyone else. Potentially he is haunted by what he's done, and I hope that's the case, and I hope that he ends his life behind the confines of prison walls. Just a quick addition. I outlined the behaviours and motivations of domestic abuse perpetrators in my video about the horrific murder of Kellyanne Bates. Check out that video if you have time. In that video, I outlined how domestic abuse perpetrators are ultimately motivated by gaining and maintaining power and control over their victims, using various tactics including violence, threats of violence, verbal abuse, etc. The case of Hobson raises another major warning flag in domestic abuse cases, and that is men who abuse their partners in full view of others, whether this be members of the family or members of the public. Often, domestic abuse perpetrators will try to hide their behaviour, knowing that if they're seen, someone will intervene. So there is ultimately some semblance within them that they know what they're doing is wrong and they try to conceal it from others. However, some men, especially the most dangerous ones, don't care. They will abuse their partners in any environment. This usually shows two things. Firstly, their normalised view of violence, with them seeing nothing wrong with acting in this way, and also likely their confidence about how much control they have over their victim, with them thinking that even if I beat her up in the middle of the street, she won't report me to the police and I'll get away scot-free. With Hobson, he saw no issue with standing on Claire whilst wielding a knife in the middle of the street. Unfortunately, in the UK, and I assume around the world, many perpetrators do get away with their crimes because their victims refuse to make a statement against them, so any case falls apart. This is often through fear, with the victim fearing that if they do report the crime to the police, then they'll come to serious harm, or potentially even be murdered. However, if you see someone being abused in the middle of the street, there are a few things you can do. Firstly, if it's safe, intervene. I think it's all our responsibility to try and protect people who are being abused by their partners. Secondly, if you see something like this, get your mobile phone out and film it, obviously from a safe distance. This isn't for morbid curiosity, but if you can capture what's going on, it's evidence. And even if the victim doesn't support a case, then you may be able to provide enough information that they can pursue what's known in the UK as a victimless prosecution, where, even if the victim withdraws their statement or complaint, there's enough evidence that people like this can't get away with it. Gary Heidnik was an American double murderer and serial rapist with a hatred of women, who, over a 4-month period between 1986 and 1987, abducted 6 women off the streets of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and held them captive in the basement of his home. He beat, tortured, and raped his captives, and whilst 4 of them miraculously survived, 2 were murdered, and one of these was dismembered. Heidnik was one of the inspirations for the character Buffalo Bill from the film Silence of the Lambs. But when you hear his story, I've no doubt you'll think he's a man far worse than any movie villain, and what he put these women through was worse than any horror movie, and like something out of a nightmare. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November the 22nd, 1943, in the Cleveland suburb of Eastlake in Ohio, to Michael and Ellen. He also had a younger brother, Trevor. Whilst Michael stated the boys were raised in a loving household, it appears it was anything but. Trevor later reported that Michael was extremely violent towards all members of the family and would beat his sons and his wife. Trevor said in an interview in 1987, quote, "Got to the point where we'd be afraid to pick anything up because he'd beat us if we dropped something like a glass or something. I was knocked unconscious once." When Heidnik was 3 years old, his parents separated and the boys went to live with their mother. However, this environment was also no place for a child, with their mother having issues with alcohol. She would often leave the children alone, or she went out drinking, bringing home different men most nights. After 4 years, the boys were returned to the care of their father and his new wife, as his mother could no longer take care of them. So both of them went out of the frying pan and back into the fire, and Heidnik reported persistent emotional and psychological abuse by his father. Heidnik was a chronic bedwetter, with his father humiliating him whenever this happened, by making him hang the urine-soaked sheets out the window, in full view of the neighbours. Also, it's reported that Heidnik and his brother were forced to wear trousers with, I assume, fabric bullseyes sewn onto them, which children at school would kick. This compounded the abuse that Heidnik already suffered, due to him receiving a serious injury to his head when he was 6 years old, which left it misshapen after he fell out of a tree. In addition, Michael had particularly discriminatory attitudes and beliefs regarding African Americans, and instilled in his sons his racist views that these individuals were lesser forms of life due to the colour of their skin. Heidnik was a morose and solitary child. He made no effort to engage with other children and appeared very aloof. On one occasion, Heidnik was approached by a female student who asked him if he'd done his homework, to which Heidnik responded by shouting at her, saying she was, quote, not worthy to speak to him. Heidnik excelled academically and was reported to have an IQ of 148, which would put him in the exceptionally gifted category. However, he had no direction in life and seemed rudderless, with him flitting from one potential profession to another. This began at the age of 14 years old, when Heidnik enrolled at Staunton Military Academy in Staunton, Virginia, but dropped out 2 years later before graduating. He then returned to school, but then dropped out at the age of 17 and joined the United States Army. It appeared that, by this point, Heidnik had developed two obsessions: becoming an army officer and making money. Heidnik was described as an excellent recruit, but following basic training, he was rejected from several specialist positions. This included in the military police, and instead he trained as an army medic in San Antonio, Texas, and, as a side hustle, he lent money to fellow soldiers and charged them interest on these loans. Heidnik was then transferred to a field hospital in West Germany. However, things began to fall apart for Gary Heidnik in late August 1962, at the age of 19, when he went to the sick bay, complaining of dizziness, blurred vision, and nausea. It's also noted that Heidnik began showing signs of mental illness, and although it's not clear what he was suffering from, given the fact he was prescribed antipsychotics, it's likely he was showing signs of schizophrenia, which potentially included him experiencing delusions and hallucinations. However, there are some who believe that he faked this diagnosis to get a discharge from the army. However, it should be noted that mental illness does appear to have been a common factor in Heidnik's family, with his brother Trevor spending time in mental institutions and attempting suicide multiple times during his life. And in 1970, Ellen, his mother, committed suicide by poisoning herself. With regards to Heidnik, he would be admitted to psychiatric hospitals no less than 20 times between 1962 and 1987 due to repeated suicide attempts. In October 1962, Heidnik was transferred to a military hospital in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. This is a condition characterized by someone who chooses to be alone and chooses to pursue solitary habits, whilst having little or no desire to interact with others outside of necessary interactions. They also have difficulty expressing emotions and reacting appropriately to situations, and they're often outwardly humorless, emotionally detached, and cold to others. It appears, due to this diagnosis, Heidnik was honourably discharged from the army and given a disability allowance. Heidnik had served a grand total of 13 months serving his country. Shortly after his discharge, he became a licensed practical nurse and enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, only to drop out a single semester later. He worked at a VA hospital in Coatesville, but was fired for poor attendance and rude behaviour towards patients, with him showing no empathy towards them and being aggressive generally towards staff and patients. It appears that despite his high intellect, Heidnik was unable to hold down a job or actually pursue a career, and he appears to have been quite entitled. It seems like he wanted to be handed professions on a plate, but when he found out this wouldn't happen immediately and would require some work, he would leave. So, with the army, when he realised he wasn't going to be promoted to a 4-star general by a week on Thursday, he got bored and wandered off. It's important to note the types of jobs or careers Heidnik was pursuing, with them all being ones where someone has power over another, whether this be an officer in the armed forces, a police officer, or a nurse. In October 1971, Heidnik set up a church called, quote, the United Church of the Ministers of God. Initially, the church had just 5 members. In 1975, he opened an account under the church's name with Merrill Lynch. The initial deposit was $1,500, but, through shrewd investment, within 10 years Heidnik had turned this into $500,000, and the church eventually grew to 50 devoted followers, led by the self-anointed Bishop Gary Heidnik. It appears this church was, in part, set up so that Heidnik could avoid paying taxes, but I think it served another purpose. It gave Heidnik a captive audience. It gave him people that would hang on his every word, and give him the sense of power he'd been attempting to find throughout his life up until this point. As his church gave him money and sense of power, Heidnik stuck with it. It was still active at the time of his arrest in 1987, with then contacting investigators to ask whether Bishop Heidnik would soon be released to lead the congregation. Some authors say that Heidnik's ultimate intention was to turn his church into a cult, and I wouldn't be surprised, as it's clear he was a man who wanted power and others doing exactly what he said, following his every command without question. However, whilst Heidnik professed to speak the word of God, his behaviour towards others was anything but holy. It appears that Gary Heidnik's first serious brush with the law was in 1976, when, after a disagreement with the tenant at a house he was renting, he fired a gun at him, with the bullet grazing his face. It's reported that in the 1970s, Heidnik would begin relationships with African-American women, with him telling others that these women, quote, treated him better than whites ever did. However, he would also specifically pick women with severe learning disabilities. This, I think, is a combination of Heidnik's racist beliefs, his narcissism, and further evidence of him wanting to place himself in positions where he controlled people. Due to his childhood, it appears that Heidnik considered African Americans to be inferior and therefore less of a threat to him. When you also add in the disability aspect, in his mind, Heidnik likely felt there was a massive power disparity in these relationships, with him being totally in control of them, being able to use and abuse his partners at will. One such woman was called Anjanette Davidson, who had significant learning disabilities. Anjanette had a sister, Alberta, who lived in a mental health institute. Alberta was a 34-year-old woman who had the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. One day in 1978, Heidnik signed Alberta out of the institution, apparently on day release. He then took her back to his property and kept her chained up in the basement. Over the next 9 days, he repeatedly raped and sodomized Alberta. Where she didn't return, the institution called the police and a search was conducted of Heidnik's property, but nothing was found, and he bought time by claiming that he put her back on a bus home. When a second search was conducted, Alberta was found confined in a small storeroom in the basement. After Alberta was medically examined, she was found to have clear signs of sexual assault, including tears in her vagina. She had also contracted gonorrhea. Heidnik was subsequently charged with kidnapping, rape, forced imprisonment, unlawful restraint, and interfering with the custody of a committed person, amongst other offences. At his trial in November 1978, Heidnik pleaded not guilty, and heartbreakingly, Alberta, due to her cognitive difficulties, was deemed unfit to testify. So, as opposed to a list of charges which would have placed Gary Heidnik behind bars forever, many of the most serious charges had to be dropped. He was eventually only convicted of unlawful restraint, interfering with the custody of a committed person, and recklessly endangering another person. Psychiatrists who assessed Heidnik indicates he showed no remorse for his actions and was extremely likely to commit similar or worse offences in the future. Heidnik was sentenced to 3 to 7 years in the state penitentiary, eventually serving 4 and being released on March 24, 1983. It isn't clear whether Heidnik's initial thinking around targeting mentally disabled women included the fact that, if he was caught, he could simply plead not guilty and they would not be able to testify against him. I think this is likely. However, even if this wasn't the case, he now had an example of the power of this strategy, with him likely thinking, yeah, I went to prison, but I served 4 rather than 24 years. I've no doubt that Heidnik was looking for loopholes and ways to avoid detection and punishment, whilst planning and fantasizing about his ultimate goal, to have control over completely subservient women who would be his personal sex slaves. Soon after his release from prison, Heidnik began using a matrimonial service and began to communicate with a woman called Betty Disto in the Philippines. In September 1985, she flew over to the US and married Heidnik in Maryland on the 3rd of October 1985. No doubt Heidnik thought that she, due to her ethnic origin, would be subservient and easy to control. He was wrong. Betty would frequently voice her concerns and hold her husband accountable for his appalling behaviour, which included him forcing her to watch whilst he had sex with other women. During their brief marriage, Betty was raped and beaten repeatedly, and it was only with the help of the Filipino community in Philadelphia that she was able to escape the marriage in January 1986. Soon afterwards, Heidnik was arrested for assault, indecent assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, but all charges were dropped when Betty, like Ruffier, did not attend the court case. At this point, I imagine the wheels in Heidnik's twisted mind were turning, with him realizing that if he wished to have a harem of women at his command, he needs to return to his original victim typology and replicate the behavior which had given him some limited success before, specifically, in the case of Alberta, confining this woman in the basement. If he could find similar vulnerable women and bring them to his basement, he would have the on-demand sex slaves he was desperate to acquire. By November 1986, Heidnik decided to put his horrific plan into action. In total, Gary Heidnik abducted 6 women from the streets of Philadelphia, with the first being 25-year-old Josephina Rivera, who, on November the 25th, 1986, was working as a prostitute in order to support her family. She was picked up by Heidnik in his white Cadillac, where he paid her for her services. After this, they went to McDonald's, where Heidnik bought Josephina some coffee. Josephina then agreed to a further trade of sex for money, but this time Heidnik wanted to do it at his home, to which she agreed. So Heidnik drove Josephina to 3520 North Marshall Street. Josephina later recalled being suspicious when she got to the home, noticing that in the front door was half the key, with Heidnik having the other half, and the door could only be opened when these two parts were held together. What Josephina didn't realise was that this was so that the keyhole could not be seen through, and the lock was essentially blocked, meaning it could only be opened from the outside. After having sex in the main bedroom, Josephina went to put her clothes back on, and Heidnik then grabbed her by the neck from behind and began to choke her. She begged him to stop, but instead, he handcuffed her wrists and pushed her down the stairs to the basement. Heidnik then got a shovel and began digging a hole in the floor of the basement, whilst telling the handcuffed Josephina that he was planning to capture 10 women whom he would force to get pregnant, and then they would raise his children. She was then pushed through the hole. She tried to escape but could not, and Heidnik left and didn't return for 27 hours. But when he didn't return alone. Sandra Lindsay was also 25 years old, and she was extremely vulnerable and was a patient at a care facility called the Elwyn Institute. Sandra was already known to Heidnik, as he'd previously raped her in the facility where she was staying, and she'd fallen pregnant, but had an abortion. On November the 26th, 1986, Heidnik took Sandra from the Elwyn Institute and brought her back to his home. Heidnik told Sandra to write a letter to her mother, saying she'd left the institute and that she was fine. He then went to New York and posted this letter. However, Sandra's mother did not believe the contents and went to the police. She must have known about Heidnik, as she gave the police his address and said her daughter was likely being held there. Tragically, the police did nothing, assuming Sandra was just another runaway. On the first night that both women were together, they were viciously raped and beaten by Heidnik, and this pattern continued each and every day. They were kept naked and had to huddle together for warmth in the unheated basement. They slowly began to fall ill due to hypothermia, starvation, and dehydration. On the 22nd of December 1986, 19-year-old Lisa Thomas was walking to a friend's house when Heidnik pulled up alongside her and asked if she was working the streets. Lisa was not a prostitute and was offended. Heidnik said he would take her wherever she wanted as a way to apologise. Eventually, the pair ended up going to dinner and then back to his house, where he drugged her wine, and Lisa soon fell unconscious. She awoke to Heidnik dragging her to the bedroom, where he raped her. He then handcuffed her and threw her in the pit in the basement. On the 2nd of January 1987, Heidnik abducted 23-year-old Deborah Dudley. It's not known how he came across her, but it appears that she was potentially homeless at the time. Deborah fought every step of the way, and Heidnik had trouble subduing her and placing her in the hole. She was viciously beaten and eventually took her place with the other captives. 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins was a sex worker who Heidnik picked up on the 18th of January 1987. After agreeing to money for sex, Jacqueline went to Heidnick's home and, after having sex, he strangled her, cuffed her, and forced her into the hole. So by the 18th of January 1987, there were 5 women chained up in Gary Heidnick's basement. By this point, the first woman he abducted, Josefina Rivera, had been living this nightmare for 52 days. Heidnick would rape and beat the women without mercy. He'd also try to divide and conquer them, with him assigning one as the leader when he went out. And when he got back, he would ask the leader which of the women had misbehaved. If no one was singled out, they would all be beaten. No doubt in order to heighten their terror, Heidnick would shove sharp objects into the women's ears in an attempt to deafen them so they could not hear him coming, but also so they didn't know when he'd left so they couldn't try to escape. Heidnick would feed the women as and when he pleased, and his erratic behaviour appeared to dictate how often they would be fed and what they would receive. On some days they'd get nothing, on other days they might get dog food, but on one occasion to celebrate one of the captive women's birthdays, he provided them with Chinese food and champagne. However, the women were malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from hypothermia, battered, bruised, and in considerable pain, with several of them becoming seriously unwell, especially Sandra Lindsay. In February 1987, Sandra angered Heidnick by trying to remove the planks of wood that sat over the hole in the basement. In response, he handcuffed one of Sandra's wrists to a beam in the ceiling and left her hanging there for days. Convinced she was pregnant with his child, Heidnick tried to force feed her in order to keep the child alive. But, in a weakened state, Sandra's body was beginning to give up. Eventually, she died, and when the handcuff was removed, she slumped to the floor. Josefina said when she saw Sandra was dead, quote, "I was broken-hearted. Me and Sandra were close. We spent so many hours together in the hole." Heidnick, the monster that he was, with cold efficiency, then sought to get rid of Sandra's body. He forced the other women to be involved in dissecting her body and used a power saw to remove her limbs, with him putting Sandra's legs and arms in the freezer, marking them as, quote, "dog food." Heidnick cooked her ribs in the oven and put Sandra's head on a stove to boil. Heidnick showed Deborah Dudley, who had fought him so hard when she was abducted, Sandra's head on the stove and warned her that she would end up the same way if she defied him. There's a rumour that Sandra's remains were ground up, mixed with dog food and fed to the other women, but this isn't backed up by the evidence. The putrid smell from cooking Sandra's body parts led to neighbours calling the police, and, when they attended, Heidnick simply said that he burnt a roast, and they left. Whilst raping and torturing these women, Heidnick would occasionally leave the basement, go upstairs in his property, and hold sermons for his church congregation before returning to continue his vile abuse. Heidnick would also use electricity to torture the women, applying a live wire to their chains, giving them electric shocks. On March the 19th, 1987, Heidnick put 3 of the women, including Deborah Dudley, into a pit filled with water whilst they were wearing chains. He then applied mains current to their bindings, and, as a result of this, Deborah died. By this point, Josefina realized the only way she was going to survive was to pretend to be compliant, and she began to convince Heidnick that she was enjoying her time with him and she was given more trust and more freedom. This included her assisting him in removing Deborah's body from the property and dumping her remains, and agreeing with him that they needed to abduct another woman in order to replace the 2 who had died. As a result of this, Heidnick would take Josefina out in his car in order to look for women to abduct. On the 23rd of March 1987, they came across 24-year-old Agnes Adams, who was known to both of them, as Heidnick had previously engaged in her services as a sex worker, and Josefina from when the pair had worked in a strip club together. She was taken back to the property, assaulted, and forced into the hole in the basement. This appeared to cement Heidnick's trust in Josefina, and on the 24th of March 1987, she asked if she could go visit family, and she promised to return with a new woman for his collection. Heidnick agreed, and drove Josephina to a petrol station and said he would wait there while she went to see her relatives. Josephina then walked a short distance away and called the police. When they arrived, they saw the imprint of restraints on her leg and thankfully believed her. The police then drove to the petrol station and arrested Gary Heidnik. The police then went to Heidnik's property and opened the basement to release the surviving women. This stunning and horrific picture shows where the officers found when they peered into the hole. The police were able to recover the body of Deborah Dudley and were able to recover some of the body parts of Sandra Lindsay. This included removing her arms and legs from the freezer. They also found pieces of her thigh, skin, and muscle, all neatly wrapped. Over 27 pounds of dismembered human remains were recovered in total. To close this section, I want to play a short clip of Josephina Rivera talking about her experiences in around 2014.
Here with me now is Josephina Rivera. Thank you so much, Josephina. I've watched this. This is the first time that I've actually seen this, and I'm trying to hold back my tears.
Right.
So I can't even imagine what you endured.
We endured a lot. We really endured a lot. I truly endured a lot, especially in the beginning, being the first one. I could just so remember just sleeping with handcuffs behind my back every night and chains on my ankles, and I would wake up and just think it was a dream, you know.
Or a nightmare, really.
A nightmare.
Right. During that time, what kept you going? What kept you alive throughout all the torture and the cruelty that you endured on a daily basis?
You know, through the strength of God, and I just said I'm going out of here the way I came in here. If I walked in here, I'm going to walk out of here.
So that was really that's what kept you focused
yes,
on that you're going to get at, the sense of determination.
Right.
What was the interaction between you and the other women?
It was really, really very difficult. I mean, we're in a situation where none of us know each other, and each one is dealing with different mental stability. And you know, I tried my best, being the first one down there, trying to calm everybody that came down. It didn't always work, you know, but, you know, you try to, you know, sit down and talk and try to keep them, you know, you ask them about their family and their kids and their life, and, you know, try to make it a little bit normalcy for them as much as possible, you know, and try to say, well, hey, you're going to be all right, you know, we're going to try to get out of here alive. And it was difficult at times. It was. When Sandra died, me and Sandra had been there from the beginning, so when Sandra died, it just really broke my heart, and it just really made me see the severity of Gary Heidnik.
Did you think you were next after she died? Did you think that he was going to go after you?
Oh, at that point, it was like anything could happen. You know, it was like a day-by-day thing. It was just, each day was worse than the day before. You know, and it just never seemed like it was getting any better.
Did you ever think, Josephina, that you were going to get out of there? Did you ever plot it? Did you ever talk
I didn't plot it. I really didn't realize how much Gary Heidnik actually liked me and how much I was getting through to him until the last few days. I knew I was going to get out of there one way or another. I mean, that was like my ultimate goal, was to make sure that I got out safely and he couldn't get to me and he couldn't get back to the other girls and get rid of them, you know. And so I don't know if there was a plan, but it worked out.
But a sense of survival that you
Yes.
had to keep yourself going throughout, no matter what.
Exactly,
That time.
and trying to deal with Heidnik himself, and then trying to deal with the other girls, and trying to put something together. It was amazing.
Now you still have some injury from what he did with your ear. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, he found out that we could hear him underground coming in and out, his car pulling in and out of the driveway, because his basement sat underground and we could hear him walking through the house. So he decided to take screwdrivers and damage our eardrums with screwdrivers.
Did you?
To dent our ears so that we wouldn't be able to hear him coming in and out.
And you still have difficulty with hearing?
Oh yeah, everything I listen to is loud.
Now, you have children, and you were reunited with your children.
Yes, I
recently.
was.
How's that?
Ricky and Zornay, I put up for adoption right after the Heineck thing happened. At the time, the foster parents and Zornay and Ricky were very close, and they were in a loving home. I personally, mentally or physically, wasn't mentally capable of taking care of them. So my decision for them to allow them to adopt them was, was a good thing. Me and LaToya stayed in touch. She came back and lived with me when she was 12, and we stayed close.
Remember what I said about Gary Heidenreich having an almost genius level IQ before? Well, on the 23rd of April 1987, he walked into court and pleaded not guilty to all offences. His initial defence? The women were already there when he moved in. That's it. This later appears to have changed, him claiming he knew about the women, but they'd killed each other. Heidenreich also made claims of cannibalism, but this was not backed up by evidence when forensic analysis of cooking utensils was undertaken, and it appears this was likely part of an insanity defence. The question of mental illness was central to this case, but the brave testimony of the surviving victims showed how methodical and planned these offences were. In addition, it was pointed out that Heidenreich was competent enough to make hundreds of thousands of dollars from investments and run a church for over 10 years. The jury didn't believe a word of it, and on the 1st of July 1988, Gary Heidenreich was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, 4 of aggravated assault, and 1 of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. He was then sentenced to death. Gary Heidenreich spent over a decade on death row and never admitted any guilt or showed any remorse for his crimes. In January 1999, he tried to escape his date with the executioner by attempting to take an overdose, but this was unsuccessful. Before his execution, Heidenreich reportedly claimed that he wanted to be executed because the execution of an innocent man would stop the death penalty in America. Just before 10 p.m. on Tuesday, July the 6th, 1999, after a last meal of 2 slices of pizza and black coffee, Gary Heidenreich stepped to the death chamber at SCI Rockview and was strapped to the gurney. At 10:12 p.m., the execution began and the lethal injection was administered. He was pronounced dead at 10:29 p.m. And, when this occurred, one of the witnesses reportedly shouted, quote, "Thank you, Jesus." He made no final statement. Before talking about this monster, I want to play a short clip of him speaking during an interview after his incarceration. Look at this man's eyes. I, for one, find them terrifying.
How much verbal exchange did you have with the girls down there in the basement?
At first, I tried to make it nice, right?
Yeah, how did you do that, Gary?
I was holding parties there for one thing. I had a Christmas party and a New Year's party.
Heidenreich told agents Douglas and Ray that he had a routine for the women he held captive in his basement.
8, they go down in the hole in the morning. Board goes over the top of the hole with the sandbags and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they stay down there till roughly about 8 at night. Okay. Now, on this particular day...
Got a radio down here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Playing real loud?
Yes.
Why is that? To drown out any noise?
Right.
In case because you're leaving the house sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you don't
I was... I'm not holding nothing back. I realize that's incriminating. That's incriminating for me to say that in a state of mind. I was conscious enough to know that was a conscious act on my part, and that was essentially the reason.
To drown out that noise, for sure.
Well, they might like a little entertainment too, you know.
The radio didn't stop the women from screaming for help, so Gary Heidenreich tried shocking them into silence with electricity.
You do say that you were electrocuted as punishment.
Yeah.
And you did that systematically for some time.
No. Only several days. Nothing was working. I was trying to find something that worked that would make them shut up to stop hollering.
So I could progressive kind of infliction of pain on these women.
I was trying to find something that would make them behave.
But it was painful to them.
I hope so. I don't mean I hope so, but I mean, you know, that's what I was trying to achieve, you know, to make them behave.
After one of the victims died from torture, Heidnik told Douglas and Ray he didn't know what to do with the body.
I'm sitting there, you know, trying to figure out what the hell to do, you know, what the to do, you know. I started chopping up the body. It makes me sick just thinking about it. I dismembered the body and I you know, started burning it on the stove and in the oven and stuff, and that was when you got the big smell and all.
You're trying to destroy the evidence.
Right.
See, some people.
I consciously knew I was trying to hide the evidence.
The lack of remorse and delusion in this man is truly horrifying. Gary Heidnik is reported to have been one of the worst, most frightening killers the FBI agent John Douglas ever spoke to. He's the man whose career was the basis for the television series Mindhunter. Remember, he interviewed some of the most depraved and vicious killers of modern time, including Edward Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy. So for Heidnik to be at the top of this infamous list is really saying something. I would agree that this man's crimes are particularly heinous, but why did he do it? I think that due to his traumatic childhood, Heidnik developed a general hatred of society, but in particular women, likely due to the lack of care from his mother. Also, due to the racist use of his father, I believe that Heidnik considered those from any ethnic background, but particularly African Americans, as an even lesser form of life. Likely due to his intellect, Heidnik appears to have felt that he was special and worthy of great things, and that others were not worthy of him. Given his gifts, I think that he assumed that people should just hand him power, and so he tried to integrate himself into society by applying for these types of positions. But, due to his own arrogance and his lack of any social skills, he was unable to obtain them, and also likely because he wasn't given what he wanted quickly enough. So, he took matters into his own hands, created scenarios in his own life where he could feel ultimate power over people, reinforcing to himself how superior he was. This included him beginning relationships with women with intellectual disabilities, knowing they were no match for him intellectually. Whilst he likely felt very powerful in these situations, he was essentially an utter coward, a tiny little man who would rape and abuse, in some cases, women who had the mental age of children. Whilst there may have been a financial motivation to him setting up his church, I have no doubt he had aspirations of being a cult leader, having ultimate power over people, commanding their every move, using them any way he wanted, and ultimately ordering their suicide if he deemed it necessary. As he amassed his religious congregation, he also collected women, like objects, using them to get his sexual kicks, and no doubt getting off on the fact they were powerless, he could kill them at any moment. I think that Gary Heidnik considered himself a god and wanted mere mortals to fear him and acknowledge his superiority over them. What Heidnik was ultimately planning to do is anyone's guess. Perhaps he was going to breed a colony, create his own cult from the ground up. However, what I find so perfect about this case is that one of these African American women, who he considered so beneath him, outsmarted him, manipulated him into believing that she supported his lunacy, and she was eventually able to take him down and save the lives of others. Sidney Cook is a British convicted rapist and suspected serial killer, currently serving a life sentence for horrific crimes against children in the 1970s. However, these offences are just the tip of the iceberg. Cook was a prolific predator who abused children from the 1960s until the 1980s, and was the head of a group of paedophiles known in the press as the Dirty Dozen. These men abducted, raped, and killed male children. Cook is one of the most remorseless, depraved, and disgusting offenders in UK criminal history, who, at the age of 95, is also one of the oldest serving prisoners in Britain. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Sidney Charles Cook was born on the 18th of April 1927 in Stroud in the county of Gloucestershire. Little is known about Cook's childhood, but he later claimed in court that he was sexually abused as a child. This may have been his way of trying to gain sympathy from the judge and portray himself as a victim, or it may indeed be true, but it's no excuse for anything that he did as an adult. In August 1945, Cook joined the British Army but was a terrible soldier, and he was frequently AWOL and served several prison sentences for this. He was eventually kicked out of the army in 1952, spending most of his time either on the run or behind bars rather than serving king and country. In the early 1960s, Cook found work as a fairground worker, which would enable him to travel around the country, interact with children, and eventually target them without suspicion. Cook specifically manned a test your strength machine, which was popular with young boys keen to show off. When Cook began sexually abusing children is unclear, but in 1961, he was given a £20 fine for molesting a boy in a cinema. Cook's next confirmed victims were two brothers, with the youngest being 10 and the elder one being around 11 or 12. They both came from an abusive household, where there were 9 children in total, with their father being described as an alcoholic, violent bully, and their mother being unable to care for the children. Cook came across the family whilst working at a fairground in 1970, and it appears that this family may also have been from this community, as the offences he committed were across various areas, indicating this family moved around frequently. The youngest boy was abused by Cook for approximately 5 years from the age of 13 years old, being anally raped, as well as being forced to perform oral sex on Cook, whilst also having him engage in this behaviour on him. The older brother was molested at the same time as his sibling for around 4 years and threatened with violence if he didn't comply. On some occasions, the boys would be taken together to an allotment and sexually assaulted by Cook and a friend of his. Remember these offences, as they'll be important later. How many children Cook molested during the 1970s is unclear, as he targeted disadvantaged families and children from backgrounds of abuse, where he could easily integrate himself, molest the children, and then, when the fairground moved on, simply up sticks and set up in another area. Cook, like other serial offenders, was able to take advantage of this nomadic lifestyle and is known to have moved around England, both north and south, going between Oxfordshire, London, Kent, Hertfordshire, and Tyne and Wear. It appears that Cook would frequently offend with his associates, who also had a sexual attraction to boys, and, as time progressed, the number of people linked to this behaviour increased, to the point where there were around 12 paedophiles who would engage in these offences, and they became known as the Dirty Dozen. Sometimes there are more than 12, sometimes less, but there appears to have been a core of dedicated and prolific paedophiles led by Sidney Cook, which included the following monsters. Leslie Bailey, known as Catweasel, due to his staring eyes which resembled the title character of the British children's TV series of the same name, was born on the 21st of June 1953 in Hackney in London. He had below average intelligence and spent the majority of his childhood in care. In 1973, Bailey sexually assaulted and attempted to murder a 7-year-old girl. For some reason, the charges were reduced and he spent just 5 months in a mental hospital. In 1979, Bailey followed a woman into a lift in a block of flats, beat her and anally raped her. He was sent to prison for 5 years for this attack, being released in around 1982. Robert Oliver was born in around 1955. His mother apparently hated the fact that she had a son, and so dressed him up in women's clothing. By the age of 14 years old, Oliver would spend most of his time at arcades, where he'd be taken advantage of by men who would give him money for sex. Lenny Smith was born in Wales on the 23rd of August 1954. He too spent much of his childhood in care and was known to be the victim of sexual violence, but also the instigator of this type of behaviour. He was the victim due to his time working as a male prostitute in London, but he would also pimp out other young men and children. Smith met Robert Oliver in around 1973, however it's not clear when he met Sidney Cook. In 1977, Smith was sent to prison for a year for gross indecency with a child. Aside from the link between Lenny Smith and Robert Oliver, it's difficult to establish when and how these 4 men met each other. However, regardless of how they met, between around the late 1970s and the 1980s, these men would take the lead in travelling around the country, abducting young boys off the street, or hiring child prostitutes, at which point they'd be drugged, held whilst other paedophiles were gathered, and then gang raped. Due to the lack of DNA evidence back in the 1970s and the early 80s, the nomadic behaviour of these men, and the vulnerability of their victims, the number of children abused by this paedophile ring has never been established. Similarly, we don't know how many children these men murdered. Conservatively, It's believed they gang raped upwards of 50 children, although this is likely to be a significant underestimation. With regards to children they murdered, this figure varies wildly depending on sources, but could be anywhere from 7 to 20. The deaths of only 3 children ever led to any charges against these men, with Cook, the leader of the group, only being convicted of offences related to one of them. On the 1st of June 1984, 7-year-old Mark Tilsley met a man on the street where he lived in Wokingham in Berkshire, who took him to a sweet shop and bought him a bag of sweets. This man was Sidney Cook, and the shopkeeper heard Cook saying that he would pay for Mark to go on the Dodgems that night. Cook was working at a local fairground, having set up his test of strength machine there. After finishing his dinner at 5:30, Mark left his home and rode his bike to the fairground. Before he left, his mother told him to be home no later than 7:30, and he said to her, quote, "Don't worry, Mum, I won't be late." These were his last words to her. It appears that by this point, Cook had already set his plan into motion, with him calling Leslie Bailey, and he and Lenny Smith travelled from London to Wokingham to attend a, quote, party that evening. When they got to the fun fair, they met Cook, who had lured Mark away from the main site on the promise of buying him sweets. It appears that Mark was becoming scared, and he resisted, and he had to be picked up and forced into the car and driven to Cook's caravan a short distance away. They then met with another paedophile, known only as Oddbod, at the caravan. Once inside, Mark was given a glass of milk laced with muscle relaxant before being raped by all 4 men. More muscle relaxant was poured down his throat, and he was gang raped again. At some point, it was noticed that Mark was dead, but Cook said he was just unconscious and returned him to the site of the abduction. The other men left, leaving Cook alone with Mark's dead body. Cook then disposed of Mark's remains, likely burying it somewhere known only to him, and, to the present day, he's never revealed where this poor child's remains are. When Mark didn't return home at 7:30, an extensive search was started, but no trace of Mark could be found. Unfortunately, it appears that he was already dead by this point, so before his parents even knew he was missing. Mark's father John passed away in 2005, and his mother Lavinia in 2011, with both parents dying before they could lay their boys to rest. On the 15th of September 1985, 6-year-old Barry Lewis was outside playing with his friends when he left and began to walk the short distance to his home in Woolworth, in South London. He never made it home. Barry was abducted by force or lured into a vehicle. It's important to point out at this point that by the early 1980s, the paedophile group led by Cook had obtained a flat, although I've read somewhere there might have been 2, in the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, East London. The flat I found information about was described as squalid and disgusting, and, whilst people did live there, the main purpose was to have a place where children could be drugged and gang raped. The lead tenant at the property and the main person who lived there was Lenny Smith. Sidney Cook was living a short distance away in another flat in Hackney. All through the early 1980s, there were sexual attacks on children in the area, likely all committed by members of this group. It's to this address that Barry was likely taken after being abducted. Here he was drugged, stripped, and anally raped by 7 or 8 men, including Sidney Cook, Robert Oliver, Leslie Bailey, and likely Lenny Smith. Barry was left covered in blood by this ordeal and was believed to have been dead. He remained in the flat until the next day, when Bailey was tasked with disposing of the boy's body. As he was driving towards the county of Essex, northeast of London, Barry stirred, and it was clear that he was still alive. Bailey then strangled Barry, and, when he was sure he was dead, dumped his body in a field in Essex, approximately 30 miles from the site of his original abduction. His body was not found until the 5th of December 1985, almost 3 months after his abduction. Jason Swift had an extremely difficult life. He was born in March 1971 in Warwickshire, in the Midlands, as one of 5 siblings. The family lived in poverty, and, due to the level of neglect in the household, Jason and his siblings were taken into care. Jason's short life was characterised by moving from place to place, from care home to care home. He also had learning difficulties, meaning he needed to attend a special school. He was described as being both quiet and withdrawn. Jason was once asked by a psychologist if he had 3 wishes, what would he ask for? He stated, quote, money, a house, and food. By late 1985, aged just 14, Jason was in London and had, for some time, been travelling around the city, going to public toilets where men would take advantage of him and pay him money or give him food in exchange for sexual services. He's also thought to have been a regular visitor to the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, and evidence was later revealed that he appears to have known Lenny Smith and was seen going in and out of his flat dozens of times in the months prior to his murder. The exact date of Jason's death is unknown, but it's believed that he was murdered on the 27th of November 1985. It's also not clear how he ended up in the flat on the Kingsmead estate, whether he was there willingly or had been abducted and taken there. However, what is known is that Sidney Cook had arranged for at least 6, but likely many more men, to pay him £5 to anally rape Jason. This included Cook himself, but also Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and inevitably Lenny Smith. Jason was drugged and raped for hours, and at some point during this ordeal he died, likely by being suffocated, with something being placed over his nose and mouth deliberately. Jason's body was then taken and dumped in a copse near a place called Stapleford Tawney in Essex, approximately 20 miles away from the site of his murder, where it was discovered on the 30th of November 1985 by a farm worker. Although he was killed after Barry Lewis, Jason's body was recovered 5 days beforehand, and the deposition sites were around 10 miles apart. Autopsies on the bodies of both Jason Swift and Barry Lewis show police that both had sustained horrific injuries from being raped by multiple men, showing them not after one man, but a group of men. Also, it was clear around the same time, in the same area, men were offering their services as babysitters in order to gain access to children to rape, and this included Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and Lenny Smith. In January 1986, the police therefore began a task force investigating the offences of this paedophile ring. Over the course of 1986 and 1987, the police interviewed thousands of witnesses and people of interest and compiled thousands of pages of evidence and intelligence. As time progressed, each of the main group members was arrested. Initially, they were detained for various sex offences, and this included Sidney Cook and Lenny Smith, who were both arrested in February 1986, related to the sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy. Whilst in prison on remand for this offence, Cook would boast about raping children and the murder of Jason Swift. He would go into graphic detail about raping and killing boys, with him saying he killed many of them. The prisoners were so disgusted that they contacted the police to tell them what they'd learnt. In June 1987, Robert Oliver was arrested and charged with abusing children whilst posing as a babysitter. Oliver was questioned about the death of Jason Swift and confessed that he knew him through Cook and Smith, therefore forming the link between them. In July 1987, Leslie Bailey was arrested and soon confessed to being present on the day that Jason died, raping him and being complicit in his death. He named all of the men that were present. This same month, Sidney Cook was confronted with all the evidence whilst in prison, and he admitted raping Jason, but claimed that he'd simply been invited to a, quote, gangbang, organised by someone else, and he was not responsible for his death. He said that Lenny Smith had brought Jason to the property originally. By 1988, enough evidence had been obtained to charge all 4 men with raping and murdering Jason Swift. Unfortunately, by the time of the trial in 1989, charges against Lenny Smith had been dropped due to lack of evidence. It's really unclear why this happened, as there were multiple witnesses who saw Jason going in and out of his property in the months before he died. Bailey and Cook had also admitted he was there and involved, and Cook even said he was the one who brought Jason to the property. As if this wasn't worse enough, after long, quote, legal arguments, the charge of murder was dropped and replaced by one of manslaughter, so acknowledging that Jason had died during the sexual assault on him, but this was not deliberate, and that he'd been suffocated accidentally during this abuse. The men were convicted on this basis. On the 12th of May 1989, the men were sentenced. Sidney Cook, was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Robert Oliver was also sentenced to 15 years in prison. The police continued to investigate the abduction, rape and murder of children. In 1990, Leslie Bailey confessed to police that he'd raped and murdered Barry Lewis, and that he'd raped Mark Tilsley, and was therefore involved in the incident which had led to his death. He gave detailed confessions about who was involved in these crimes, as well as outlining multiple other offences committed by the group. He stated that there were at least 8 burial sites dotted around the south of England where victims were buried, but was vague with the details, and none of these sites were located. It appears that in May 1991, the police began a series of 64 interviews with Sidney Cook whilst he was in prison. During these interactions, he apparently went into minute detail about raping Barry Lewis, clearly taking great glee in reliving the experience. However, despite Leslie Bailey's confession and Cook's admission, no one else was charged with these murders, which seems absolutely ridiculous to me. What led to this decision was the fact that Leslie Bailey had significant underlying cognitive and emotional issues, and this, coupled with the fact that he was a child rapist, meant he was not considered a credible witness. In addition to this, Cook subsequently withdrew his confession to raping Barry, and there was little other evidence, so there was not enough to charge anyone else with the offences related to Mark and Barry. So Bailey stood alone in the dock when on the 14th of June 1991, he pleaded guilty to murdering and raping Barry Lewis, and on the 22nd of October 1992, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter and rape of Mark Tilsley. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, but I don't have any information about how long he was meant to serve before he could apply for parole. However, it doesn't matter, as Bailey would never see freedom again, and his time in prison was short. On October the 7th, 1993, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Whitemoor, a Category A prison in Cambridgeshire. He'd been murdered, strangled to death by 2 inmates as retribution for his crimes. Before turning to what has become of Sidney Cook, I want to look at the fates of the other men involved in this case. It's clear that Lenny Smith essentially escaped justice for his part in the murders of children. However, he did not ride off into the sunset. A prolific and dangerous sex offender, he was eventually sent to prison for 10 years in 1992 for a string of horrific sex offences against a 6-year-old boy he was babysitting. He was released from prison in June 1999, but requested to be placed in a secure housing block for offenders next to Nottingham Prison. It appears this was a housing block where serious offenders would go to before moving on to another property, but Smith never left there. It seems that the crimes of the Dirty Dozen had been well publicised by this point, and the community was in uproar about any of these men ever seeing freedom again. Smith likely knew that if he stepped out into the real world, he would be murdered. This was a well-founded concern, given that Leslie Bailey had already been murdered, but also a man named Bill Malcolm was murdered in February 2000. He was living in a property in East London when someone knocked on the door. When he opened it, he was shot at point-blank range in the head. Malcolm was an associate of the Dirty Dozen, but I'm unsure exactly what offences he was involved in with them. However, his record is described as appalling in and of itself, and it included him raping a 6-year-old girl. Then, when he was released from prison, tracking her down and raping her again, while saying, quote, "You put me away, you bitch." It's believed this was an organised hit by gangs who felt he deserved to die for his crimes. No one mourned his passing. So Lenny Smith, likely fearing he would suffer the same fate, lived in this property attached to the prison, apparently leaving only once or twice for 7 years until his death from AIDS in 2006. Robert Oliver served his original sentence and was released, apparently changing his name. Due to his crimes, he was required to register as a sex offender and have restrictions about having contact with children, i.e. he shouldn't have any at all ever. In July 2013, he was jailed for 3 years for breaching these conditions, as he'd apparently gone into a household with children and sent a birthday card to a 1-year-old. He was released in 2014 and is apparently still alive, but probably with a new name. So what became of Sidney Cook? Sickeningly, his sentence of 19 years was reduced by the Court of Appeal to 16 years in 1992, as he was able to argue that, due to Leslie Bailey's confessions, he must have been the leader of the group. He was just following. Why this made a difference, I do not know. However, the police knew that he was the ringleader. This meant that Cook would be released in 1998. During his time in prison, Cook showed no remorse and refused to undertake any rehabilitation programs. In fact, he revelled in his offending and was seen as a celebrity by other paedophiles. He would describe in graphic detail how he'd raped and murdered children, claiming he killed between 15 and 20. The public was well aware of how dangerous Cook was, and so, when he was released on the 6th of April 1998, they were waiting for him. Despite changing his name to Sidney Lomas, Cook was easily recognisable, and it was clear that if someone got their hands on him, they would tear him limb from limb. Cook was housed at Yeovil Police Station in Somerset for his own protection and stayed there for 9 months, not leaving the premises. The police knew they had an extremely dangerous child rapist and murderer now released. It was only a matter of time until he began offending. They needed something, anything, to hang on him, to get him off the streets forever. Luckily, they got a break. They were able to obtain statements from the 2 brothers I mentioned at the beginning of the video, who Cook abused for years in the 1970s. Based on this, on the 20th of April 1999, just over a year after his release, Sidney Cook was charged with 18 sexual offences against these children, including rape and sexual assault. During his police interview, he admitted the offences, and showing his disgusting, distorted thinking, he told the officers that the reason why he'd performed oral sex on one of the boys, after he'd forced this child to do this to him, was because, quote, he gave me entertainment, and I returned the compliment. Sidney Cook was remanded to custody after being arrested, and on the 17th of December 1999, he appeared at Wolverhampton Crown Court before Judge David Poole for sentencing, having pleaded guilty to the offences for which he was charged. Judge Poole stated, quote, "The reports before me are unanimous, that notwithstanding your advancing years, you remain for the time being, and will remain for an incalculable period, a serious danger to children." He then sentenced him. Sidney Cook was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 5 years before he could apply for parole. Sidney Cook has been eligible to apply for parole from around 2004, and at the time of recording, this has been refused 10 times, most recently in October 2021. He was back in the papers again in October 2022, when a story appeared about him making an appeal to get his freedom. Obviously, a story like this produces panic, and I sometimes wonder whether the authors are just ignorant of how things work, or know and just want to be sensationalist. Basically, prisoners on life sentences can apply for parole at regular intervals. This is reviewed by the parole board. This happens maybe once a year or once every 2 years. The parole board can decide to release them back into the world, move them to open conditions, which is a less restrictive environment, or refuse either of these 2 things. Cook has been denied either release or moved to open prisons since he first became eligible for parole and remains in the Monster Mansion, H&P Wakefield, a cash VA prison which houses some of the country's most dangerous offenders. The fact he still remains in this environment and has not been moved to a lower security prison for his entire time in custody shows what the authorities think of him. Sidney Cook can apply for release until the cows come home, but he'll never be released. And, at the age of 95, he's hopefully coming to the end of his miserable life, and the next headline will be about his death. Sidney Cook is one of the most prolific and remorseless child sex offenders and murderers the UK has ever seen, and that is just what we know. Unfortunately, Cook committed his offences at a time when there were no CCTV cameras, and our understanding of DNA was still in its infancy. He was a calculating and predatory sex offender, travelling the length and breadth of the country abusing children. I've no doubt that he specifically chose working at a fairground, knowing this would attract little boys who he could then abuse before packing up and moving on to a new site quickly without anyone batting an eyelid. His type of victim was not arbitrary either. Cook targeted children he knew had fallen through the cracks in society, like Jason Swift, a lost young man who was already being abused by predatory men when all he wanted was a roof over his head and food in his belly. Sidney Cook is a man who devoted his whole life to the abuse of children. He was inevitably a sexual psychopath. I've no doubt that he got sexual gratification from hearing the screams of his victims. He also saw that he could make money from this, and so got men to pay him to rape the children he obtained. The men who he committed these offences with were no less evil. All of them were deeply disturbed, horrific excuses for human beings. Together, these men and all of the others involved formed an unholy alliance intent on meeting their disgusting sexual need to abuse young boys, destroying their bodies, and for those they did not kill, inflicting wounds so deep psychologically and emotionally that I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people they abused and let live committed suicide afterwards, or struggled with being able to cope in their life until this very day. People who victimise children are cowards, pure and simple, but Cook existed in a world surrounded by pathetic cowards and gained a sense of celebrity from these pathetic sycophants. All through his time in prison, it appears he wanted recognition and praise for the things he had done. I've read that Cook is a remorseless and arrogant man, and imagine that if you sat down with him, he would sit there with a smirk on his face, just asking for a kicking. The most heartbreaking part of this story is just how little we know about the crimes of Cook and the so-called Dirty Dozen. Several men I haven't mentioned were convicted of their part in this paedophile ring, but the majority were never identified and never prosecuted. This lack of knowledge also means the identities of all the children they murdered will never be known. Each one of these victims represents a life that was snatched away before it even begun, but also a family who never knew what happened to their loved one, or, even worse, because of the type of children he targeted, some may never have been reported missing. Their disappearances may not have even been noticed. I hope that all of the children who died at the hands of Sidney Cook and his disgusting band of paedophiles are at peace, and the ones that survived have been able to rebuild their lives despite what these monsters did to them.
Elliot Rodger was an American spree killer who, on May the 23rd, 2014, at age 22, ended the lives of 6 innocent people in Isla Vista, California. His rationale for doing this? Simply put, he was punishing society because no girls would sleep with him. However, as I will discuss, this is an oversimplification, and Elliot was a dangerous combination of misogynism, racism, and extreme narcissism. An individual who believed he was, quote, the supreme gentleman, which meant he was entitled to anything you wanted, and those who did not comply deserved to be eliminated. As if Elliot's beliefs and crimes were not horrific enough, he's become a revered figure within the world of involuntary celibates, known as incels, and his words and deeds have been linked to other acts of terror and murder. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Elliot Oliver Robertson Rodger was born on the 24th of July 1991 in London in the UK to his Malaysian Chinese mother Lee Chin and his father, British filmmaker Peter Rodger. I tend to refer to the subjects of my videos by their last names, but as his first and last names could both be first names, I'm just going to refer to him as Elliot, otherwise it may cause confusion, mainly to myself. Whilst there's plenty of information about Elliot's upbringing from official sources, the intricacies of his life, including his perception of his situations and people, is contained within his manifesto/autobiography, which he completed just prior to his death. This 137-page diatribe, entitled, quote, My Twisted World, is a fascinating and yet horrifying piece of prose, filled with hate, self-delusion, perceived persecution, and self-entitlement. It's a chilling document when you consider that it's basically the rambling self-delusion of a murderer who, by the time of writing it, had already decided to execute members of society because he could not get what he wanted. It begins with the following paragraph, quote, Humanity. All of my suffering on this world has been at the hands of humanity, particularly women.
It has made me realise just how brutal and twisted humanity is as a species. All I ever wanted was to fit in and live a happy life amongst humanity, but I was cast out and rejected, forced to endure an existence of loneliness and insignificance, all because the females of the human species were incapable of seeing the value of me. This is the story of how I, Elliot Rodger, came to be. This is the story of my entire life. It is a dark story of sadness, anger, and hatred. It's a story of war against cruel injustice. In this magnificent story, I'll disclose every single detail about my life, every single significant experience that I've pulled from my superior memory, as well as how these experiences have shaped my views of the world. This tragedy did not just happen. I didn't want things to turn out this way, but humanity forced my hand, and this story will explain why. My life did start out dark and twisted. I started out as a happy and blissful child, living my life to the fullest in a world I thought was good and pure. I will refer to this document throughout this video to highlight key moments in Elliot's life and how he perceived them, and how he devolved into a killer. Elliot was raised in a privileged household, in large part due to his father's work as a professional photographer and then a filmmaker, with him being the assistant director on the original Hunger Games movie in 2012. His mother was also involved in the film industry, and Elliot wrote about attending preschool at Dorset House School, West Sussex, where fees begin at around £10,000 a year, so around $12,000. Elliot also described going on frequent holidays abroad, and some years later, even walking the red carpet at the premiere of Star Wars Episode 1 in 1999 due to his mother's friendship with George Lucas. Just before his 5th birthday, his parents gave birth to a sister, Georgia. Soon after this, the family moved to California so his father could be at the heart of the film industry. I think the initial seeds of what Elliot became were sown during these early years. Obviously, people with means who have children will try and give them the best life possible and the best experiences, which is completely understandable. However, I think this needs to be balanced with a reality check, showing them you need to earn things, they're not just handed to you. Just because you come from this background, it doesn't automatically make you special. The true measure of a man is not the size of his bank account. However, I think, for whatever reason, Elliot was not taught this as a child, and he felt entitled to special treatment from others, believing that he was superior, and that it was everyone else's job to recognise this and cater to his needs. At age 7, Elliot's parents separated. It is clear from his own writings this had a significant impact on him, as it took him completely by surprise. Elliot wrote regarding this, quote, "Very shortly after my 7th birthday, the news came. I believe it was my mother who told me that she and my father were getting a divorce. My mother, who only a few months before told me that such a thing would never happen. I was absolutely shocked, outraged, and above all, overwhelmed. This was a huge life-changing event. I think that this is the first signs of issues with women, with a tiny seed being planted in Elliot's mind that the woman he trusted most in the world, his mother, had essentially lied to him." Soon afterwards, Elliot's father began a relationship with a Moroccan film actress called Soumaya Akaboun. However, clearly there was conflict between her and Elliot, with him writing, quote, "For the initial period of her being a new member of the family, we got along well, as she was quite fun. But soon, she would start to discipline me in a harsh way that I wasn't used to. I felt that because she wasn't my real parent, she had no right to discipline me in such a way, and so I rebelled. That's where the first conflicts arose. There would be many more to come in later years." This was likely Soumaya trying to instill boundaries on Elliot's behaviour, but, likely because he thought he was special and should be allowed to act in any way he wanted, he did not take kindly to this. And, as the years progressed, it's clear that Elliot saw Soumaya as a thorn in his side, with him writing that when he was 9 years old, quote, "I started to have intense conflicts with Soumaya. I hated the rules she imposed on me, which I believe she had no right to impose, as she wasn't my true parent." Despite his privileged upbringing, it seems that Elliot was actually a very lonely child. He writes about spending weeks with his mother and father, but during the weeks with his father, he'd be looked after by nannies and barely spend time with his dad. Issues also began to come out around the age of 9, with Elliot admitting that he had always had issues with jealousy throughout his life, as well as crippling insecurities. With the latter of these, Elliot was upset he was short for his age and played basketball, believed this would somehow make him taller. With the former issue, Elliot had intense feelings of resentment and jealousy,
when his playmates would not focus all their attention on him. If he had two friends around, he'd become upset if they began playing with each other and not him. This is an important part of the behaviour of Elliot, which can explain much of his resentment moving forward. Specifically, it appears that Elliot was a timid and shy child who struggled in social interactions. This is not uncommon, and in these situations, even as adults, it's often easier when someone else is leading the conversation or organising events. We can all have the pang of awkwardness or anxiety and potentially jealousy when we go to a party with a friend and then they leave us to go to talk to other people we don't know and we just stand there. But we understand, although it may still be an uncomfortable feeling, this is our issue. Our friend is free to go and do what they please, and people can share their attention without it being some kind of swipe at us. We also know that while some people may come and talk to us, we need to be brave and sometimes take the first step. However, Elliot doesn't appear to have learned this, and as time progressed, he appears to form the opinion that others, and particularly girls, should flock to him, chase him, and pay him full attention without him making any effort. When he entered the room, all eyes should turn to him, and women, even if they were mid-sentence, should drop what they were doing and throw themselves at his feet. If they did not, this was an affront to him personally. Moving forward several years, Elliot became a brother when he was 12 years old, with his father and Sumaya having a baby boy called Jazz. Elliot seemed excited to become a brother, but unfortunately, as his brother grew, Elliot began to see him as a rival, someone who might surpass him and take attention away from him, something he could not stand. All through his early years, it appears that his mother and stepmother would arrange play dates with other children and try to get Elliot to socialise. But by the time he was 13, he had only one friend and struggled to socialise with others. He found solace in online gaming as a distraction from, quote, the harsh realities of life I was too scared to face. Elliot was teased by girls in middle school, and one in particular seems to have led him to develop a hatred of girls. He began acting up as a way to get attention, with him writing prophetically, quote, as middle school approached its ultimate end, I was having a miserable time there. I was extremely unpopular, widely disliked, and viewed as the weirdest kid in the school. I had to act weird in order to gain attention. I was tired of being the invisible shy child. Infamy is better than total obscurity. High school was an even bigger challenge for Elliot, as he was now going through puberty, and he stated, quote, I developed a very high sex drive and would always remain like this. This was the start of hell for me. Going through puberty utterly doomed my existence. It condemned me to a life of suffering and unfulfilled desires. Even at that young age, I felt depressed because I wanted sex, yet I felt unworthy of it. I didn't think I was ever going to experience sex in reality, and I was right. I never did. I was finally interested in girls, but there was no way I could ever get them, and so my starvation began. The boys in my grade talked about sex a lot. Some of them even told me they had sex with their girlfriends. This was the most devastating and traumatizing thing I've heard in my life. Boys having sex at my age of 14. I couldn't fathom it. How is it they're able to have such intimate and pleasurable experiences with girls while I can only fantasize about it? I frequently started asking myself, this was an all-boys school. How in the hell were these boys able to meet girls to have sex with? I wondered. I hoped they were lying. I hoped against hope. Hearing that really shook me to the core. Words cannot describe how much hatred and envy I felt for those boys. That hatred would only fester the more I suffer from my sexual starvation. I was too scared to tell anyone about it, and I hid it well, for a time. These recent events caused me to withdraw even further away from the world. I drowned all of my misery in my online games. Elliot described his schoolmates bullying him, whilst apparently then returning to their attractive girlfriends. He had scathing resentment towards the bullies, but more so towards the girls they were with. Why did they choose these bullies over him? At the age of 17 years old, Elliot's mindset became more radicalized, and he began devolving into the spiteful, hate-filled individual that 5 years later would go on a killing spree. He wrote that, quote, one day I found some posts on the internet about teenagers having sex, and I was once again reminded of the life I've been denied. I felt that no girl would ever want to have sex with me, and I developed extreme feelings of envy, hatred, and anger towards anyone who has a sex life. I saw them as the enemy.
I felt condemned to live a life of lonely celibacy, while other boys were allowed to experience the pleasures of sex, all because girls didn't want me. I felt inferior and undesirable. This time, however, I couldn't just stand by and accept such an injustice anymore. I refused to continue hiding away from the world and forgetting about all the insults it's dealt to me. I began to have fancies of becoming very powerful and stopping everyone from having sex. I wanted to take their sex away from them, just like they took it away from me. I saw sex as an evil and barbaric act, all because I was unable to have it. This was the major turning point. My anger made me stronger inside. This is when I formed my ideas that sex should be outlawed. It's the only way to make the world a fair and just place. If I can't have it, I will destroy it. That's the conclusion I came to, right then and there. I spent more time studying the world, seeing the world for the horrible, unfair place it is. I then had the revelation that just because I was condemned to suffer a life of loneliness and rejection doesn't mean I am insignificant. I have an exceptionally high level of intelligence. I see the world differently than anyone else. Because of all of the injustices I went through and the worldview I developed because of them, I must be destined for greatness. I must be destined to change the world, to shape it into an image that suits me. Elliot seemed to have spent the next 2 years turning further in on himself, reading books that reinforced his increasingly misogynistic attitudes, cutting himself off from the real world, and losing himself in video games where he would end up in arguments with people if they even mentioned having a girlfriend. On the rare occasions that Elliot would go out with males his own age, and there were girls present, he would sit there and see that these girls had the disrespect to talk to these men and not focus all their attention on him. The really curious thing about Elliot's ramblings is there's almost not a single instance of him ever talking to a girl or going on a date and being rejected. This wouldn't justify his beliefs, but it would enable some level of understanding. Rather, it seems he literally sat on the sidelines, growing more and more resentful whenever he saw any man and woman his age interacting, not trying to do anything about his situation, and likely making him unapproachable. I mean, imagine you're a woman walking up to the table with 2 men, and each time you're trying to interact with one of them, the other is becoming more and more irritable, rude and obnoxious. You're hardly going to want to talk to that person. But in Elliot's world, women should be throwing themselves at his feet, begging him to have sex with them whilst he does nothing, because he was entitled to this. He was special, but the world just couldn't see it. He wasn't the problem. Everyone else was. At the age of 19 years old, Elliot Rodger was becoming more unhinged, and around this time, he moved to an apartment in Santa Barbara to attend the University of California, Santa Barbara, and ominously wrote at this time, quote, "The move to Santa Barbara is the end game, the ultimate climax of everything. I saw it as a new chance that was given to me to finally have the things I want in life: love, sex, friends, fun, acceptance, a sense of belonging. But I can never forgive the world for denying me such things in the past. I was already turning 20 soon. I already lost many years of my life. I deserve better than that. I am an intelligent gentleman. I deserve the love of girls more than the other obnoxious boys of my age. And yet, they get girls and I don't. This is a crime that can never be forgotten, nor can it be forgiven. I always wanted to exact my revenge on humanity for forcing me to live such a life, but I've also always had the hope that if I could do things in my life to make up for all my suffering, then that in itself would be a form of peaceful revenge. In truth, the move to Santa Barbara was actually a chance that I was giving to the world, not the other way around. I was giving the world one last chance to give me the life that I know I'm entitled to, the life that other boys are able to live with ease. If I still have to suffer the same rejection and injustice, even after I move to Santa Barbara, then that will be the last straw. I will have my vengeance." However, Elliot found issues almost immediately with Santa Barbara. Despite not leaving the property and doing anything about his situation, he was unhappy that he was not instantly presented with sexual opportunities and resented his housemates, who he claimed would frequently brag about their success with girls. Elliot's musings then demonstrate his racist attitudes and his extreme narcissistic beliefs, with him writing about his annoyance with an African-American man who had more success with women than him. Quote, "How could an inferior, ugly black boy be able to get a white girl and not me? I am beautiful, and I'm half white myself.
I am descended from British aristocracy. He is descended from slaves. I deserve it more. I tried not to believe his foul words, but they were already said. It was hard to erase them from my mind. If this is actually true, if this ugly black filth was able to have sex with a blonde white girl at the age of 13, whilst I've had to suffer virginity all my life, then this just proves how ridiculous the female gender is. They would give themselves to this filthy scum, but they reject me, the injustice. Females truly have something mentally wrong with them. Their minds are flawed, and at this point in my life, I was beginning to see it. The more I explored my college town of Isla Vista, the more ridiculousness I witnessed. All of the hot, beautiful girls walked around with obnoxious, tough, jock-type men who passed all the time and acted crazy. They should be going for intelligent gentlemen such as myself. Women are sexually attracted to the wrong type of men. It's a major flaw in the very foundation of humanity. It's completely and utterly wrong in every sense of the word. As his truth fully dawned on me, I became deeply disturbed by them, deeply disturbed, offended, and traumatized. College was like a red rag-tailed ball for Elliot. He was surrounded by thousands of young couples, and each time he saw this, he became more and more enraged about his apparent injustice in life. He deserved these things, yet no one was simply handing this to him. So, in his mind, no one should have anything. Around this time, Elliot began recording videos to upload to YouTube, moaning about how unfair his life was, and he appears to have driven round specifically looking for situations to antagonize himself, and then filming them, as shown by this video. Elliot Roger here. I'm just sitting in my car right now, enjoying the view of the beach. And my view has been ruined by this sight right here. In front of me, sitting right there on that bench, is a young couple. I was enjoying such a nice view until they came and sat down and started kissing. This is the reason why life isn't fair. Why can't I experience something like that? I have to show everyone why I hate the world, because no girl would do this with me. I hate them. I hate them so much. It's not fair. Life is not fair. Elliot soon began acting on his anger, initially in small ways, including following a couple out of Starbucks and throwing his coffee over their car, and later filling a super soak with orange juice and squirting couples in the park. Elliot wrote, quote, "It was around this point in my life that I realized I was capable of doing such things. I would happily do such things. I was capable of killing them, and I wanted to. I wanted to kill them slowly, to strip the skins off their flesh. They deserve it. The males deserved it for taking the females away from me, and the females deserved it for choosing those males instead of me. Ever since I was 17, I often fantasized about becoming powerful and inflicting suffering upon everyone who has wronged me in the past, but never thought I'd actually do it. At this point, after going through so much suffering and injustice, all of my innocence had been swept away. The world had been cruel to me, and it molded me to become strong enough to actually have the capability of returning that cruelness to the world. I'd never been a violent person in nature, but after building up so much hatred over the years, I realized that I wouldn't hesitate to kill or even torture my hated enemies if I was given the opportunity. In around 2012, Elliot began to plan for, quote, the day of retribution, where he would take revenge on society, and especially the girls who shunned him. He stated, quote, "My first act of preparation was the purchase of my first handgun. I did this quickly and hastily, at a local gun shop called Galetta Gun and Supply. I'd already done some research of handguns. I decided to purchase the Glock 34 semi-automatic pistol, an efficient and highly accurate weapon. I signed all the papers. I was told my pickup day was in mid-December. That fell in nicely, because that was when I was planning on staying in Santa Barbara till. After I picked up the handgun, I brought it back to my room and felt a new sense of power. I was now armed. Who's the alpha male now, bitches? I thought to myself, regarding all of the girls who've looked down on me in the past. I could give Mad my new weapon before locking it up in my safe and preparing to go back to my hometown for the winter break. In spring 2013, Elliot purchased another 2 handguns and began collecting ammunition
and planning his revenge, which was underpinned by his belief that, quote, women must be punished for their crimes of rejecting such a magnificent gentleman as myself. Around this time, Elliot joined online forums with similarly disturbed and misogynistic young men who were apparently starved of sex. No doubt, on these forums, Elliot found kindred spirits, and they reinforced his own views of women and cemented his perception that he was the victim, with him writing, quote, I concluded that women are flawed.
There is something mentally wrong with the way their brains are wired, as if they haven't evolved from animal-like thinking. They're incapable of reason or thinking rationally. They're like animals, completely controlled by their primal, depraved emotions and impulses. This is what they're attracted to, barbaric, wild, beast-like men. They're beasts themselves. Beasts should not be able to have any rights in a civilized society. If their wickedness is not contained, the whole of humanity will be held back from advancement to a more civilized state. Women should not have the right to choose who to mate with. That choice should be made for them by civilized men of intelligence. If women have the freedom to choose which men to mate with, like they do today, they would breed with stupid, degenerate men, which would only produce stupid, degenerate offspring. This in turn would hinder the advancement of humanity. Not only hinder it, but devolve humanity completely. Women are like a plague that must be quarantined. When I came to this brilliant, perfect revelation, I felt like everything was now clear to me in a bitter, twisted way. I'm one of the few people on this world who has the intelligence to see this. I'm like a god, and my purpose is to exact ultimate retribution on all of the impurities I see in the world. So women are inferior, and should literally be presented to men like him to have sex with. No consent, no choice in the matter. Sounds like rape to me. Many articles I've read have said that Elliot Rodger did what he did because he couldn't get a girlfriend. This is completely incorrect. Elliot Rodger was not interested in a girlfriend. He was not interested in any emotional connection with a female. He saw women merely as objects to get his sexual needs met. Like a classic narcissist, he saw value only in what people could give to him. Hence why he was advocating basically a system where women would be used and abused by men based on an allocation system, with him likely seeing himself as the overseer of this twisted system. From approximately 2012, Elliot was completely alone. His behaviour and attitudes have pushed everyone away. However, concerns about his mental health were flagged, but not acted upon. Specifically, in April 2014, just weeks before the rampage, his mother found the videos that Elliot had posted on YouTube and was concerned, so called one of his counsellors. The counsellor called mental health services and then the police. Santa Barbara County Sheriff's deputies showed up at Elliot's doorstep to check on his mental health. However, they weren't aware of any of the videos. They determined that Elliot was a well-mannered, if shy young man who posed no risk. They then left. This was the last opportunity to stop Elliot. There'll be no more chances. Elliot had planned his day of retribution in great detail, writing the following long description. He said, quote, on the day before the day of retribution, I will start the first phase of my vengeance, started killing as many people as I can around Isla Vista by luring them into my apartment through some form of trickery. The first people I would have to kill are my two housemates, to secure the entire apartment for myself as my personal torture and killing chamber. After that, I'll start luring people into my apartment, knock them out with a hammer, and slit their throats. I'll torture some of the good-looking people before I kill them, assuming that the good-looking ones had the best sex lives. All of that pleasure they had in their life, I will punish by bringing them pain and suffering. I've lived a life of pain and suffering, and it was time to bring that pain to people who actually deserve it. I will cut them, flay them, strip all the skin off their flesh, and pour boiling water all over them while they're still alive, as well as any other form of torture I can possibly think of. When they're dead, I'll behead them and keep their heads in a bag, for their heads will play a major role in the final phase. This first phase will represent my vengeance against all of the men who have had pleasurable sex lives while I've had to suffer. Things will be fair once I make them suffer as I did. I will finally even the score. The second phase will take place on the day of retribution itself, just before the climactic massacre. The second phase will represent my war on women. I will punish all females for the crime of depriving me of sex.
They have starved me of sex for my entire youth and gave that pleasure to other men. In doing so, they took many years of my life away. I cannot kill every single female on earth, but I can deliver a devastating blow that will shake all of them to the core of their wicked hearts. I'll attack the very girls who represent everything I hate in the female gender, the hottest sorority of UCSB. After doing a lot of extensive research within the last year, I found out that the sorority with the most beautiful girls is Alpha Phi sorority. I know exactly where their house is, and I've sat outside it in my car to stalk them many times. Alpha Phi sorority is full of hot, beautiful blonde girls, the kind of girls I've always desired, but was never able to have because they all look down on me. They're all spoilt, heartless, wicked bitches. They think they're superior to me, and if I ever try to ask them on a date, they'll reject me cruelly. I will sneak into their house at around 9 PM on the day of retribution, just before all of the partying starts, and slaughter every single one of them with my guns and knives. If I have time, I'll set their whole house on fire. Then we shall see who the superior one really is. The final phase of the day of retribution will be my ultimate showdown in the streets of Isla Vista. On the morning before, I will drive down to my father's house to kill my little brother, denying him of the chance to grow up to surpass me, along with my stepmother, Sumaya, as she will be in the way. My father will be away on one of his business trips, so thankfully, I won't have to deal with him. If he didn't go away on that trip, I might even have to postpone the whole plan because of my fear that I might hesitate if I had to kill him. Once I've taken care of my brother and stepmother, I will switch to the Mercedes SUV and drive it back to the Isla Vista. I will use it as one of my killing machines against my enemies. An SUV will cause a lot more damage than my BMW. After I have killed all of the sorority girls at the Alpha Phi house, I will quickly get into the SUV before the police arrive, assuming they would arrive within 3 minutes. I will then make my way to Del Playa, splattering as many of my enemies as I can with the SUV and shooting anyone I don't splatter. I can only imagine how sweet it will be to ram the SUV into all of these groups of popular young people who I've always witnessed walking right in the middle of the road as if they are better than everyone else. When they're writhing in pain, their bodies broken and dying after I splatter them, they will fully realize their crimes. Once I reach Del Playa Street, I will dump the bag of severed heads I've saved from my previous victims, proclaiming to everyone how much I've made them all suffer. Once they see all of their friends' heads roll onto the street, everyone will fear me as the powerful god I am. I will then start massacring everyone on Del Playa Street. I'll pull up next to house parties and fire bullets at everyone partying on the front yard. I'll specifically target the good-looking people and all of the couples. After I've destroyed a house party, I will continue down Del Playa, destroying everything and everyone. When I see the first police car come to their rescue, I will drive away as fast as I can, shooting and ramming anyone in my path until I find a suitable place to finally end my life. Eventually, Elliot Rogers chose Friday, May the 23rd, 2014, for his day of revenge. The day before, Elliot recorded his last YouTube video. In it, like in his other videos, he's extremely smug and acting like some sort of Marvel supervillain. It would be pathetic if it wasn't for the fact this man was fully willing to end the lives of others due to his own inadequacies.
Hi, Elliot Roger here. Well, this is my last video. It all has to come to this. Tomorrow is the day of retribution. The day in which I will have my revenge against humanity, against all of you. For the last 8 years of my life, ever since I've hit puberty, I've been forced to endure an existence of loneliness, rejection, and unfulfilled desires, all because girls have never been attracted to me. Girls gave their affection and sex and love to other men, but never to me. I'm 22 years old, and I'm still a virgin. I've never even kissed a girl. I've been through college for 2.5 years, more than that actually, and I'm still a virgin. and has been very torturous. College is the time when everyone experiences those things such as sex and fun and pleasure. But in those years, I've had to rot in loneliness. It's not fair. You girls have never been attracted to me. I don't know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I will punish you all for it. It's an injustice, a crime, because I don't know what you don't see in me. I'm the perfect guy. And yet you throw yourselves at all these obnoxious men, instead of me, the supreme gentleman. I will punish all of you for it. On the day of retribution, I am going to enter the hottest sorority house of UCSB. And I will slaughter every single spoiled, stuck-up, blonde slut I see inside there. All those girls that I've desired so much, they would have all rejected me and looked down upon me as an inferior man if I ever made a sexual advance towards them. While they throw themselves at these obnoxious brutes. I'll take great pleasure in slaughtering all of you. You will finally see that I am, in truth, the superior one, the true alpha male. Yes. After I've annihilated every single girl in the sorority house, I'll take to the streets of Isla Vista and slay every single person I see there. All those popular kids who live such lives of hedonistic pleasure while I've had to rot in loneliness for all these years. They've all looked down upon me every time I tried to go out and join them. They've all treated me like a mouse. Well, now, I will be a god compared to you. You will all be animals. You are animals, and I will slaughter you like animals. I'll be a god, exacting my retribution on all those who deserve it. And you do deserve it, just for the crime of living a better life than me. All you popular kids, you've never accepted me, and now you'll all pay for it. And girls, all I've ever wanted was to love you and to be loved by you. I've wanted a girlfriend. I've wanted sex. I've wanted love, affection, adoration. But you think I'm unworthy of it. That's a crime that can never be forgiven. If I can't have you, girls, I will destroy you. You denied me a happy life, and in turn, I will deny all of you life. It's only fair. I hate all of you. Humanity is a disgusting, wretched, depraved species. If I had it in my power, I would stop at nothing to reduce every single one of you to mountains of skulls and rivers of blood. And rightfully so. You deserve to be annihilated. And I will give that to you. You never showed me any mercy, and so I will show you none. You forced me to suffer all my life, and now I'll make you all suffer. I've waited a long time for this. I'll give you exactly what you deserve, all of you, all you girls who rejected me and looked down upon me and, treated me like scum while you gave yourselves to other men. And all of you men for living a better life than me, all of you sexually active men, I hate you. I hate all of you. I can't wait to give you exactly what you deserve. Utter annihilation.
At around 5 p.m. on May the 23rd, 2014, Elliot Rogers stabbed to death his two flatmates, 20-year-old Wei Han Wang and 20-year-old Chen Hong. He also murdered their friend, 19-year-old George Chen, who was visiting, again by repeatedly stabbing him. All three were best friends. George volunteered for a Buddhist organization and often helped elderly neighbors get their mail and take out the rubbish. A former high school friend described Cheng as, quote, the kindest kid, so generous, so giving, always willing to help people out. Wei Han's mother lamented how she could carry on with her life without her son in the world. Elliot then spent the next several hours preparing for the second part of his plan. At around 8 p.m, he went to a local Starbucks to get a latte, and at 8:30 p.m, was seen in his vehicle working on his laptop. By 9 p.m, Elliot was driving his BMW north to the Alpha Phi sorority house. When he got there, he found the door was locked, and sorority members heard loud and aggressive knocking at the front door. Luckily, no one opened it to him. However, Elliot started shooting at young women who were standing outside the building. One survived, but two, 19-year-old Veronica Weiss and Katie Cooper, aged 22, both died. As opposed to the monsters that Elliot portrayed these women to be, they were both exceptional, who were loved and would have made a difference to the world. Veronica was described as someone obsessed with sport and a kind-hearted person. Katie was weeks away from graduating, and a high school teacher stated, quote, she was one of 2,500 students I've taught over the years, but Katie was a standout. Elliot then travelled south, began firing into an unoccupied coffee shop on Pardale Road, and then into the Isla Vista Deli Mart, as shown by this terrifying footage. It was here that 20-year-old Christopher Ross Michael Martinez was hit 7 times and died almost immediately. Chris was a man with aspirations. After graduating, he was planning on going to law school, but he was cut down in his prime. Elliot continued driving south on the wrong side of the road, hitting a pedestrian and firing at 2 others, who he missed. He then shot a couple coming out of a pizza parlour and fired at another woman but missed. Elliot then drove in a loop around a city block and engaged in a gun battle with sheriff's deputies. Elliot continued driving erratically, hitting 2 pedestrians with his car before shooting and wounding 3 passers-by. Elliot then struck another skateboarder with his car, but shot and wounded 2 men. Elliot then exchanged gunfire with 3 sheriff's deputies and was shot in the hip. Pursued by police, Elliot hit another cyclist before crashing into the curb. At 9:30 p.m, police approached Elliot's car and found him dead in the driver's seat, having put a bullet in his own brain. Found in the vehicle were his guns and over 500 rounds of unspent ammunition. Elliot's rampage claimed the lives of 6 people, not including him, and injured 14 others, 7 of whom were shot and 7 who had suffered blunt force trauma from being hit by his vehicle. The community of Isla Vista was in shock by the mindless violence that claimed the lives of 6 innocent students. There were, as is often the case after these events, discussions about gun control, with it being pointed out how easily Elliot Rodger was able to gain access to guns. But, as is always the case, nothing really seems to have changed.
However, the most sickening part of this case is the veneration of Elliot Rodger after his act of pure evil. Since the dawn of the internet, there have always been unstable and hate-filled people filling message boards with bile, but after the crimes of Elliot, the number of message boards devoted to the involuntary celibate movement, commonly known as incels, exploded, with dedicated web forums being created at an alarming rate. The common theme of these forums? Hero worship of Elliot Rodger, including pictures of his face superimposed on pictures of saints, with him being known as Saint Elliot, and his videos on YouTube enabling disturbed individuals to espouse their admiration of the actions of this coward. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. Elliot has been cited as the inspiration of several disturbed men who've gone on killing sprees of their own. For example, Alex Manassian, the perpetrator of the 2018 Toronto van attack, which killed 11 people and injured 15 others, cited Elliot Rodger as his inspiration for the massacre. In the UK, 22-year-old Jake Davidson was obsessed with the incel movement and, like Elliot, posted videos of himself ranting about his rejection by women. Davidson eventually went on a killing spree in Plymouth in the UK on the 12th of August 2021, in which he killed 5 people with a shotgun, including his mother and a 3-year-old child, before taking his own life. I'll cover both of these cases in future videos. However, it's clear that the horrific crimes of Elliot Rodger have given a face to a dangerous and insidious movement that has spread across the world. It's enabled potentially dangerous people to be able to justify their internal hate, nurture it, and then project it onto the world as a whole, resulting in the murders of innocent people who have usually never met the person who killed them and have had their lives snatched away from them simply because these weak, pathetic men are unable to accept rejection or the fact that the world does not revolve around them. This whole video has been a profile of Elliot Rodger, but I wish to give my final thoughts and bring everything together. The more I look into Elliot Rodger, the more disturbing and dangerous his case becomes. In my opinion, he was a combination of some of the most concerning personality traits which a person can possess. He was extremely narcissistic, entitled, arrogant, clearly psychopathic, misogynistic, racist and violent. Elliot expected the world just to fall into his lap, and, as I said earlier, it's fascinating reading his insane ramblings over 137 pages, as there is almost no reference to him actually doing anything about his lack of sex. He never seems to have spoken to any girls, and genuinely seems to think that women should have fallen at his feet, removed all their clothes, and begged him to have sex with them. Elliot's callousness is shown not only by his crimes, but the extent of his plans, which included torturing and beheading people he was jealous of, and even killing his 10-year-old brother just in case he surpassed him one day. This epitomizes Elliot. If he can't have things, no one can. If someone is a threat to him, they deserve to die. I do have some sympathy for the child that Elliot was. Lonely, awkward, and struggling to fit in. At the core of him was a deep, dark hole of insecurity and fear. However, I have no sympathy for the monster he became and his inability to self-reflect and think, maybe why I'm in this position is because I'm a bit of a douche. I should do something about that. No, instead he externalized everything and deemed society as a whole guilty of his failings, and, acting as judge, jury, and executioner, he meted out punishment, even though most of the people he killed and tried to kill had no idea who he was and had nothing to do with his situation. His actions also demonstrate his utter cowardice. He killed himself in order to avoid being held accountable for his actions, knowing that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, likely on death row, and he would have lost control. I dread to think what would have happened if Elliot had lived long enough to find a woman to have sex with. I imagine this woman would have quickly become the center of his obsession, with him demanding sex whenever he wanted, and this would have likely occurred, in my opinion, whether she consented or not. I imagine he would have been a stalker, someone who refused to take no for an answer or be marginalized for someone's life. Worse still, an actual girlfriend. I think any woman who'd been in a relationship with Elliot
would have been controlled, demeaned, raped, and generally horrifically abused repeatedly, given his perception of women as objects, his underlying insecurities, and his violent tendencies. I've little doubt that if a girlfriend or woman he had sex with rejected him, he would have killed them. Outside of relationships, I think Elliot's words are quite insightful into the fact that at 22 years old, he seemed to think he was the most persecuted human being on earth. This makes me think that he was wholly unprepared for life in general, and that he might have faced many situations in his life, for example losing a job, being demoted, and responded with extreme violence towards whoever he felt aggrieved by. Elliot Rodger claimed to be the victim. However, these are the real victims. He was a pathetic creature whose continued reverence by a small group of equally disturbed individuals is testament to their own delusional thinking and is not shared by wider society, where this man is rightly reviled.